This is Minecraft, the most popular game in the world. It released over a decade ago, and through the years it's transformed itself over and over again, keeping players gripped more than any other game on the planet. And I've transformed the game entirely. Every environment, every structure, even down to the finest details like the soundtrack and achievements, all in a single island. I've included inspirations from across the globe, adding brand new structures, stories, and features, revolutionizing how survival Minecraft can be played by both players and viewers alike. After dedicating my life to this project for over a year, I have finally released the world download on my Patreon. But stay tuned to find out everything you need to know about the map and see for yourselves how I brought this world to life. So to get started in my enormous quest to transform the world's most popular game, Steph and I spent hours researching and discussing how we can make one giant island that could somehow contain virtually every key aspect of the game. We sketched out a general layout for the ultimate survival world island, which would span across 16 million blocks. Yep, you heard that correctly. If you stacked up every Minecraft block in this map, you could nerd pole through the center of the earth and still have millions of blocks to spare. We tried to place the environments in the most logical way possible, so you're not walking around from the freezing snowy mountains straight into the scorching hot desert. We even thought about some of the themes and real-world inspirations we could include in different areas. So with the layout planned, I jumped into World Painter to bring this epic plan to life in Minecraft. I built a huge mountain range for the snowy biome, broke up the island with some rivers and lakes, dug out a grand canyon in the Mesa, added sand dunes in the desert, and painted on the different biomes so that they'd register in-game. And as you can see, this island is enormous, and we have a heck of a lot planned to fill it. To give you just a tiny teaser of what to look forward to, I've planned an epic Wild West inspired town and railroad for the Mesa, an abandoned ancient city for the jungle, a dwarven kingdom in the deep dark caves, and so much more. That's not to mention all of the hidden Easter eggs, backstory, challenges, and custom loot, along with tons of insane ideas that you guys have come up with. With our empty island ready, I pasted in all of the vanilla structures ready for me to upgrade. First, I added villages into every biome, including those that don't naturally spawn villages. Next, I added in a bunch of pillager outposts across the map, which will also be themed based on their location. And finally, I placed all of Minecraft's structures into their corresponding biomes. Plus, when we get to transforming, I'll be adding some of my own custom structures as well. With the structures in place, I moved on to the vanilla trees, placing them across the entire map to simulate how they would spawn in a naturally generated Minecraft world. And I have to admit, I did add some oak tree clusters to the plains, even though they don't usually spawn there. It felt way too bare without any. And so our vanilla Minecraft map is ready for a big transformation. So let's get started with the plains. For our first transformation, I wanted to keep things pretty simple and true to the original game, especially since the plains is the most common biome in Minecraft, and it's the central hub and spawn point of our island. The first transformation to tackle are the oak trees scattered across the plains. I built several trees in a more realistic style in different sizes, and replaced the vanilla ones with our shiny new ones throughout the biome. The environment was still looking pretty empty, so I also created some small bushes and boulders to help populate the empty space and break up the landscape a bit. Before transforming the outpost in the village, I upgraded the island's ruined portal, which, when repaired, will lead to an epic transformation of the Nether. I played with the design a little, but ultimately settled on this stone archway, which nicely mimics the original design, just upscaled and a bit more dramatic. I added some damage and nether materials to make it look as though the nether blasted through to the overworld when this portal was first made by the island's resident witches, who inhabit the mushroom swamp down south. According to USW legend, the portal was destroyed by the plains villagers to prevent the Piglin clan from wreaking havoc on the overworld after the witches tried to steal resources from the nether. Spooky stuff, but it makes a pretty epic centerpiece for the island. At the other end of the plains, I'd placed down a pillager outpost, so I headed there for the next upgrade. Now I thought it'd be cool to match the materials with the sources of wood accessible in this biome, so I switched out the dark oak for some lighter oak, and topped off the tower with the pillager faction's very own flag. The pillagers who inhabit this camp are actually ex-villagers from the Plains village who are stationed here to guard the border from the witch coven that inhabits the mushroom swamp. It's no wonder they're hostile to strangers, with witches living so nearby. To complete the pillager outpost camp, I took some of the small decorations that can spawn at an outpost tower and made some tweaks, just to enhance what you'd usually come across in vanilla. I updated the tents, training dummies, cages, and also added some of my own decorations, including a fire pit and bundles of oak logs. I used these new assets to decorate and surrounded the campsite with a spiked wood wall for a handmade look. Now this really looks like a fortified base put together by the pillagers themselves. To add an extra line of defense for our witch hunting pillagers, I added 2 guard towers either side of the entrance, trying to match it with the design of the main tower. And that's our outpost upgrade complete. Which biome's outpost upgrade are you most excited to see? And to finish up the plains, I headed to the village. Now in Minecraft, villagers can have a variety of professions which give you different options for trading. A villager's profession is determined when a specific block is placed near them. But a lot of the time, their houses don't actually reflect their job roles that noticeably. This is something I thought would really elevate the Minecraft survival experience. So I decided to enhance all of the profession buildings, choosing different selections for all of my village transformations. In the plains, I dedicated my first building to the local fishermen. I branched off from the large lake with a river leading to a small pond and repurposed one of the original village houses for the fishermen to live in. I kept things really simple for these designs, with the plains being our most true to vanilla transformation on the whole island. There'll be plenty of crazy builds elsewhere. I added a couple of little piers, which will make nice fishing spots for both our villagers and for you guys, and I couldn't resist building some small fishing boats out on the lake. Next, I decided to make a windmill for the local farmer. The poor farmers in default Minecraft villages don't get a cool house to live in. They're just out tending to their crops all day. So I figured a quaint windmill would make a nice little home for our plains farmer. For the next section, I actually added a totally custom addition, a beekeeper and a little bee haven. Obviously, vanilla Minecraft doesn't have a beekeeper profession, but I thought this was such a cool way to include the game's bees in the village and give that aspect of the game a little revamp. With a large space left in front of the windmill, I of course had to add a crop farm. The villagers here are definitely hungry for some veg to go with their fish. I divided the farm up into 3 fields, one for wheat, one for potatoes, and another for carrots, also making a stream for our water source. With the farm finished, I worked on the layout for the rest of the village, creating some new, more natural looking paths, and quickly upgrading the village bell before gradually repositioning the remaining village buildings. Next up, I made some small tweaks to the librarian's house, and of course, I'm upgrading all of the interiors as I go as well. Throughout these transformations, I'll be showing you some of the interiors I've created, but I'm also going to be leaving a lot for you guys to discover for yourselves. Anyhow, I topped off the library with a small bell tower, before working on the stonemason's house. To suit the profession, I used more stone in this design, and repurposed one of the gables to shelter the entrance. I added some custom boulders, and out back I even created this miniature quarry, featuring this large, almost medieval looking pulverizer to help our stonemason villager break up all of that stone underground. For these little stall decorations, I whipped up an upgrade and created a nice little market square where the villagers can trade and sell goods. When you guys visit here, you can upgrade these market stalls by giving the villagers professions so they'll trade with you and replenish your supplies between your adventures across the map. And at the back of the market, I added a travelling wagon for the cleric. Clerics are religious leaders, and would typically spawn in the village's church. But I thought this wagon would be a cool alternative for this village, because the cleric tends to sell mysterious and magical items in-game. So you might find these mysterious travelling merchants in wagons across the map. To wrap up our market square, I added a supply cart and benches before moving on to the church. This transformation is once again pretty true to the original game. But across the USW, we'll be transforming our villagers' place of worship with different religions and cultures in mind, taking inspiration from around the world to create our own fantasy buildings. This church-inspired building ended up bigger than I expected. Honestly, it looks a bit more like a cathedral, but this still felt like a tiny build compared to my creative projects. Finally, I revamped the remaining village houses for our nitwits and unemployed villagers to live in, and scattered them around the village before adding some finishing touches. I upgraded the little fountain design outside the church, placed some hay barrels, whipped up a lamppost design, transformed the flower pot design, and scattered around some shrubbery. And that's our plains biome upgraded. So let's take a look at the transformation. I thought the mushroom and swamp biomes complemented each other nicely, so I combined them to create the ultimate spooky, witch-infested island. To connect our mushroom swamp to the main island, I built a medieval-style gatehouse and bridge before adding some damage to the middle section. There's a reason the Plains villagers have stationed an outpost so close to the border. This peculiar-looking island once looked much like the Plains, with fields, trees, and quaint little houses, until one day a child from the Plains stumbled across the bridge, and her curiosity took her across. She spotted a beautiful glowing altar in the centre of the village and went to investigate, discovering an assortment of crystals, candles, and dried flowers, shrouded in a vibrant green glow. Curious, she picked up one of the crystals and heard a loud shriek from the other side of the mysterious village. She'd accidentally broken an ancient spell, used by a coven of witches to disguise themselves from the outside world. The girl made a run for the bridge, as her surroundings began to transform around her. The terrain became more menacing, the fields were becoming waterlogged, the trees were transforming into giant mushrooms, and the once quaint houses started to look unusual and creepy. As the girl neared the end of the bridge, the witch who had discovered her sent a spell after her in an attempt to protect the coven's secrets. The girl escaped unscathed, but the bridge was badly damaged. Since that day, no one has ventured to the island to see what remains. Some even say there's a mysterious ogre who lives deep within the swamp. And so that wraps up our spooky mushroom swamp transformation. For our desert transformation, I kick things off by rearranging the vanilla village layout to create a clear village centre and main street, taking a little inspiration from Breath of the Wild's Gerudo Town. With the main strip laid out, I repositioned the village buildings neatly either side, prioritising the larger ones and the profession buildings, leaving the remaining buildings and decorations for later. Our first profession building of the village is none other than the Shepherd. This Shepherd is actually a very important character in USW lore, as he once lived in the sandstone ruins which lie just across the dunes. In fact, the villagers who lived here narrowly escaped a grisly fate, and rebuilt their lives in this village after they escaped the evil pharaoh who once ruled these lands. Anyhow, next up I built a house for the stonemason. I tried my best to match these buildings to the surrounding environment, meaning they're predominantly made up of lighter materials that are found in the area, to beat off that scorching desert sun, with colourful draped cloth providing some shade. And with our stonemason complete, I moved on to the village library, for which I took inspiration from mosque architecture. I tweaked this design a little later, as I didn't want to take away from my transformation of the vanilla place of worship, which is coming up. Honestly guys, the best part about building this for survival is that I get to challenge myself with different themes whilst keeping things survival friendly, which includes adding interiors to every single building. Now moving on to the toolsmith. I stuck to the same theme here, but added plenty of furnaces so the local toolsmith can forge and create a variety of tools for their fellow villagers to use. I then whipped up this gatehouse to guard the entrance of the village, before transforming some more large houses to make things feel more bustling and populated. And to finish off the main desert village, I built a grand mosque to house the cleric at the back of the village, fitting pretty nicely with our Egyptian inspirations. Throughout this project, I really wanted to influence our designs and lore with real-life cultures and histories. Even though it's all fantasy and not intended to be accurate, Steph and I wanted this project to feel inclusive and unique. For this particular place of worship, I used the Mosque of Muhammad Ali as a reference to create my own design. And seeing as the desert and jungle are historic allies in the ultimate survival world, it was only fitting that the jungle supplied the desert with some new wood to rebuild their village following their escape from the evil pharaoh. So you might spot some jungle wood around the village, which complements the sandstone and terracotta really nicely. Finally, with all of our larger buildings complete, I was left with a bunch of very small, cube-like buildings to transform and scatter throughout the town. These custom houses are still very simple in design and are pretty much still just square buildings, but I added plenty of small details and colour variation to really make these immersive to explore. Moving on to the decorations, I transformed the pile of scattered hay, adding it to the back of a wagon, and housed the village bell in some sandstone. I then added the wagons throughout the town and placed the bell at the end of the main street. And for a final touch, I upgraded the almighty desert well. Down on the ground, the village looks even busier, with market stalls cluttering the main street, greenery clinging to the village buildings, and apparently all of the villagers want to go for a swim. So, let's move on, shall we? So moving on to one of the most popular vanilla structures in Minecraft, the Desert Temple. And first things first, I basically quadrupled the size of it because I wanted to create a truly epic spectacle in our desert. The entrance of the original Desert Temple looks somewhat like a face, so I thought a massive skull would work perfectly to replicate this on a much more grand scale. Plus, it's a great way to ward off attackers. Centuries ago, the evil pharaoh forced his subjects to build this temple for him to store his vast collections of treasures. He fell into an obsession and a dangerous greed for such things, leading to the summoning of a merciless demon from the Nether. I mean, that was never going to end well, was it? Anyhow, this skull was actually from an old build of mine, so I made tons of adjustments to the sculpt to make sure it fit nicely as an entrance to the temple, finishing up by igniting the skull's eye sockets and creating a staircase leading inside. The other main feature of the vanilla temple's design are these two large towers that sit on the front two corners of the pyramid. On these pillars, the pharaoh demanded that the eyes of the sun god and the moon goddess were to be etched, as he believed that this would grant the building and its precious contents protection during both the day and the night. On the second level of the tower, I built a statue loosely based on an ancient Egyptian Medjay. The Medjay were an elite force used to protect valuable areas, so they're a perfect addition to our paranoid pharaoh's temple. Next, I added crenellations and built a snake symbol on the other side, as this was used to symbolise royalty in ancient Egypt. Plus, our evil pharaoh wanted to remind those pesky sandstone villagers who was boss. And to top these menacing towers off, I added a couple of giant fire braziers before completing the exterior by splitting the main body of the pyramid into 3 sections and creating walkways on each level. I added further fire braziers to decorate and a protruding section on the pyramid side to create some side entrances and make the shape a little more interesting. I then repositioned our desert temple in the terrain, blending the sand dunes to sit flush with the build. And of course, we can't forget the interior. I wanted to go for a very clean interior to match that of the vanilla pyramid, and to leave plenty of space for the pharaoh's collection of treasures. Although, they're actually no longer hidden in here, so I think you might have to search for them elsewhere. Our menacing pyramid is complete, and beneath lies the pharaoh's tomb, filled with the remaining treasure and secrets. Just be sure you don't miss a step, as it's rigged with booby traps. And to add that TrixyBlox twist to this desert, I wanted to include a few custom builds, starting with the sandstone ruins. The desert people who once lived here grew tired of the evil pharaoh's cruelty, so they sought the help of the jungle to overthrow him. The pharaoh grew wise to this plot, and in his anger, he summoned a wither to wreak havoc on the people. But the wither turned on the pharaoh, after destroying the ancient village and leaving it in ruins, as you can see. Many of the people fled to other regions before returning to their homeland years later to start again, gradually establishing themselves in the nearby village. These ruins are a reminder of the destruction caused by the last known person to summon a wither. Perhaps until one day an epic Minecrafter like you will take on the challenge. These ruins are great fun to explore, and you may just find some old hidden treasure and story within. Another feature I wanted to add to spice up the desert was an oasis or two, so I dug out an area and built several palm trees at varying heights. I pasted them in clusters and decorated with plenty of greenery. I included a bunch of tropical fish and even a few turtle eggs as well. Stumbling across these on your adventures could be a real lifesaver, but you better just hope that it's not all just a mirage. Moving away from the desert and towards the beaches, it's time to transform Minecraft's shipwreck. Now this particular shipwreck was struck by a devastating spell by the nearby witch coven on the mysterious Mushroom Swamp Island. Pirates from a distant land had got their hands on the first clue to the treasure hunt leading to the lost treasure of the evil pharaoh and made their way to the island. They ventured too close to the witch's domain, leaving their ship wrecked on the USW beaches, and the pirates themselves seemingly lost to the sea. So with our lovely, unbroken ship built, it's time for a little destruction. These kind of tweaks take a ton of manual work, but the results are always worth it. After fixing things up, I built some tattered sails hanging limply from the masts after being left to rot. Perhaps on the inside there are some clues about what really happened, or even the first riddle to a huge treasure hunt involving dangerous quests that span across the entire map. And I guess you'll have to find those out for yourselves. And since I'd already placed another vanilla shipwreck on the beach next to the jungle, I decided to change things up and make this into an actual ship, sailing in to explore the uncharted lands of the jungle. I made some changes to the colour scheme of the hull and added the shrouds, which is the rigging that stabilises the masts. And then I worked on the sails, which took a little bit of time as I made them organic, as though the wind is blowing into them at a slight angle. I added in a foresail at the front before finishing the rest. Since I was going for that black pearl vibe, I thought it would only be appropriate if the sails followed suit. I suppose she looks a little less tatty and weather-beaten, but I guess this was around the time when Captain Jack first obtained the ship, so she's not too battered and bruised yet.
Why is the rum gone?
Here you can see her in all of her glory approaching the jungle's beach. Perhaps there's something hidden there. Captain Jack wouldn't be making this journey for nothing. You'll also find a rowboat at shore. Let's hope those pirates don't nab whatever they're looking for before you guys get the chance. And our desert transformation is complete. So, first things first in our dark forest, I removed the original darkwood trees to make way for our brand new woodland. And as you can see, I really wanted to upgrade the scale of these trees dramatically to create a spooky, fantasy forest like something from a fairy tale. And because I'm building a survival-friendly world, I had to ensure that the trees had enough branches to stop the leaves from decaying once placed. I ended up building 4 different trees, making sure they had enough variation in height and shape to avoid a repetitive-looking forest. I thought it would make sense to create a few little man-made bridges to connect the plains biome to the darkwood at different ends of the biome. Perhaps this was built by the villagers to aid in travelling across to trade in each other's biomes. Okay, now it's time for some major changes. I really wanted to add a bit of variation to the landscape, especially around the main village, as the biome previously felt way too flat. So I quite literally repositioned and pasted an entire mountainscape here. Then, I cut through the entire biome to create a river flowing through and connecting to the large lake in the centre of the island. With that done, I started layering the landscape up the side of this hill to create a tiered effect, as this would be the foundations for our new village. As you can see, I dug out a few routes for some rivers and waterfalls, stemming from a large lake of water that sits behind the village, encased in some mysterious mountain peaks. With a lot of the main terraforming complete, I started to fill out the forest with those trees that I made. Before placing the rest of the trees, I wanted to include a small lake with a monument in the centre. Legend says that one of the most powerful swords in the land was placed there by a mysterious wizard, who claimed that only a worthy adventurer would be able to retrieve it. Do you reckon you'll be up to the challenge? Now we've got to fill out the remaining half of the biome to finish our dense darkwood forest. Honestly, when you guys play this, you will never run out of a wood supply. You could build an entire kingdom from chopping down even just one of these trees. And if you can't face chopping down all of my creations, you could always make yourself a tree farm from the saplings. Anyway, before moving on, we've got to fill this forest with some shrubbery and rock clusters. Placing these custom bushes and rocks around really fills out the forest floor, making it much more dense and like an overgrown woodland. These decorations literally cover the entire biome, so you won't want to stray too far from the pathway, otherwise you might get lost. And this is our magical forest, ready for some epic builds. If you look around closely, you'll even find fireflies in this biome when you're exploring in Java. Now, since the main pathway weaves throughout the forest, I whipped up a bunch of bridges to cross the cliff sides and allow access between each section of the biome. So starting with the first of our profession-based buildings for the Darkwood village, the cleric, or I suppose in this case, the rabbi. Now, as mentioned in earlier chapters, I'm changing things up for the village church and using different inspirations for the places of worship across the biomes. So far, I've been inspired by a church in the plains biome, a mosque in the desert, and for the Darkwood, I decided to refer to synagogue architecture. The synagogue is a Jewish place of worship, but can also double as a place to study and a community centre as well, so it's a perfect centrepiece for our forest village. Now, after researching into the architecture of a typical synagogue, I discovered that they're not limited to a particular style or shape. They vary in design quite a lot. However, the most notable features I found from reference images of real-life synagogues were large, circular windows sandwiched between two towers with bulb-like roofs. So I used this as a reference point and added my own twists. Which alternative place of worship would you most like to see in Minecraft? As for the interior of the synagogue, I discovered that the style and layout seemed to vary quite a bit. The only thing that did seem to persist were archways overlooking balconies either side, rows of pews, and a raised platform. You can access the second floor via the front towers, and with the design laid out, I mirrored it to the other side of the building. I realised how massive I ended up making this building once I attempted placing it down. I guess I was kind of compensating for the fact that the Dark Forest doesn't spawn its own villages in default Minecraft. Our second profession-based building is for the village cartographer. I settled on a peaked roof, fantasy style for this building, which will loosely persist throughout the remainder of this village. Obviously, because the cartographer lives here, I had to include a separate lookout tower that connects to the side of the building. I then tackled the next profession building, the weaponsmith. The plan for this building layout was to follow the same sort of design as the vanilla building, with the main forgery and large furnaces residing on a stone platform work area that's attached to the side of the building. You'll also notice I added a slight curvature to the rooftops of each building using slabs and trapdoors. That, in combination with diagonal building, is super time consuming. Honestly, I don't really know why I do this to myself. With the weaponsmith complete, I had to accompany it with an armourer. You can actually see the vanilla armourer building to the right, which of course I used as reference. And with the main profession buildings complete, I placed them at different levels across the village. As for filling up the remaining space, I used my trusty red wool to plot out a guideline for the remaining village houses. From that, I started building up individual village houses on loads of different angles. I really limited my use of world edit here and had to create these houses by hand, but it avoids repetition and creates a way more immersive environment for you guys to explore, especially with all of the interiors. Now, to add even more variation to the village and to enhance that fantasy theme, I included some Hobbit-inspired houses embedded in the different layers of the terrain. I built the original Hobbit house normally and had to include a few diagonal variants along the final top layer of the village. Even though I didn't plan to include the farmer profession in this biome, I thought it would fit nicely in one of these flat spaces I created up on the hillside. Plus, I couldn't leave these villagers going hungry. And to bring our little custom village to life, I redesigned a few small decorations, including a cart, a small flower bed, a lantern, a bell, and a well to scatter around the village. But it was still missing a little magic. So, the hidden lake behind the village has a mystery of its own. A crazy old wizard lives up there. He spends his days trying to unravel the mysteries of the ultimate survival world. The cursed treasure of the evil pharaoh from the desert, the eerie beached shipwreck, the peculiar coven of witches in the mushroom swamp biome, the bizarre disappearance of the wealthy family who lived in a nearby woodland mansion, and much, much more. Perhaps this kooky old guy has discovered something more about this surreal island and its secrets, not to mention the legendary fabled treasure. As you can see, I went for a traditional wizard tower vibe, sticking with the materials that match the rest of our Darkwood forest. To make this tower a little more wacky and puzzling, I added plenty of smaller rooftops to the main tower to finalise the design. And that's our custom village complete. So, what do you guys think of it? And finally, we're moving on to the woodland mansion, which literally could have been an entire video on its own. So as you can see, I'm starting with the entrance and really trying to channel a menacing vibe into my building. Now, I've seen a few woodland mansion transformations that give off a sort of ski lodge or log cabin vibe, which is cool, but I think a mansion should look a little more intimidating and ominous. For the main entrance, I opted for this grand design with 3 feature windows at the top and a harshly sloped roof. Even though the original Woodland Mansion's roof is super flat, I thought I could take that feature and put my own spin on it with a harshly sloped roof, since it still has a large surface area. To make the front even more grand and imposing, I decided to add towers on either side. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm definitely getting spooky vibes already. I got to work adding plenty of details whilst still maintaining some semblance of the original design, before repositioning things so that the serious building can start. Once said to be home to a rich family of merchants, this ominous mansion contains many secrets. Trading across the vast regions of the Ultimate Survivor world, this family learned many secrets about the island, its history, and its inhabitants. Many attempted to infiltrate the mansion, in hopes of uncovering ancient secrets or hidden treasure. But the wizard cast protective enchantments to help keep the family safe. One day, the family mysteriously disappeared without a trace, and the mansion is now said to be home to far more fearsome inhabitants these days. I wonder if you guys will be able to work out what really happened. Anyhow, with the front and sides of the mansion complete, I thought it would be cool to create a courtyard in the centre, with a bunch of walkways, balconies, roof variation, and even a clock tower. I mean, it doesn't actually work, but hey, it's still accurate twice a day. I then finished up by adding tons of extra details. These kinds of features take tons of time to plan and design, but they can really elevate your Minecraft build to a whole new level. I don't know about you guys, but I can definitely imagine the merchant family living here in its heyday. Now, with the exterior of our new mansion complete, I spruced up the surrounding environment to match our shiny new build. I whipped up several mountains to surround the mansion and provide a more interesting and intimidating backdrop. Having said that, I actually returned here later in the project and made some drastic improvements to the terrain after learning more building techniques. But that's for a later chapter. Lastly, I added in the trees, rocks, and shrubbery we created earlier to finish this section of the Darkwood Forest. And of course, we created that perfect opening in the middle of our mansion for a courtyard. So I decorated it with pathways, bushes, flowers, and a fountain. As a final addition to the mansion, I mixed in different block materials to add texture and wear and tear to the mansion. It is abandoned after all. So, that just leaves the enormous task of tackling the interior. First things first, I dissected the vanilla mansion just to see the different types of rooms we're dealing with. That way, I could really make this an authentic upgrade. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to paste the hallways and rooms into the new mansion and directly transform them. However, I can build an interior that follows the same kind of style to the vanilla version, just with larger rooms and much more detail. As you can see, our new mansion was initially a hollow shell for the most part, with some remnants of the vanilla interior. So I cleared it out in preparation for all of our new rooms. Using an assortment of my trusty coloured wool, I mapped out the ground level of the mansion, marking out hallways, rooms, and staircases. Of course, the first room we need as soon as you walk into the front door of the mansion is a grand entrance. The main reason I started here was because I planned to keep this entrance very open plan, allowing access from all 3 floors of the mansion to balconies with a view all the way down to the bottom floor. As for the hallways, the most notable part of the vanilla design is the pillared supports on either side that line the walls, so I recreated that in my own style. I made sure to add plenty of small decorations which took up the majority of time, from banners to plant pots, paintings, armor stands, and cobwebs to add that creepy and abandoned vibe we're going for. That's not to mention all the special loot and lore related items. I then tackled the second floor, plotting out all the different rooms and decorating the long winding hallways. And not forgetting the third floor, where I had to plan and decorate yet again, making sure to include plenty of chests, which of course means lots of epic loot for you guys. So starting with the first main room, I decided this mansion needed a grand kitchen. So I added a laundry area, a large cooking area, a classic checkered kitchen floor, and some tables for food prep. I then added some sinks, lighting, chests, towels, well, banners, and a whole lot more to really bring the kitchen to life, as if it was left this way many years ago when the Darkwood merchants disappeared. Next up is the grand bedroom. We can't have a mansion without a classic 4-poster bed. I also added a nice big rug, a bookshelf, a little grandfather clock, a wardrobe, and some armor stands. This family's ancestors were famously members of the USW Order of Knights, so they have a pretty sweet collection. Another essential room in a classic mansion is a big old dining room, so that's our next stop. I added this long table and chairs as well as some decorations, and of course taking a few bits of cake to keep me going through all of this building. Now for a cozy library, where the merchant family wrote their diary entries and gathered to tell each other stories. Honestly guys, I don't think anyone could read all of these books in one lifetime. Just to quickly show you guys some of the other many rooms I spent hours adding, including vanilla upgrades and new additions, we have a once cozy lounge and study area, a fully stacked wine cellar for the family's partying, an upgrade of the villager statue room, which might just be linked to the ancient relics in the jungle biome, and finally a chest room crammed full to the brim with chests. As well as these main rooms, there are a bunch of smaller rooms throughout this huge mansion. Last but not least, we have the abandoned zombie village to tackle. For this area, I adapted some of the Darkwood village buildings so that they looked a little more ruined and abandoned. If you're wondering why this village has been left like this, it all started many years ago when a plague began to spread throughout the community. It almost took over the whole village, with some survivors fleeing to the Darkwood village. Terrified that they might have brought this plague with them, the Darkwood villagers would not allow the survivors to settle there. With nowhere else to go, the outcast surviving villagers fled across the river to the jungle and turned to a life of pillaging. Their story continues in the jungle chapter. But anyway, as you can see, this little fishing village would have been a picturesque little community in its heyday. Maybe as a side quest, you guys will be challenged with the task of cleansing the village of the plague to restore the community to its prime. And with the rest of the trees and forest decorations added, let's take a look at all of our progress. Jumping into the jungle, it's time for some major terraforming, although we've got to keep things survival friendly as usual. Now I know I'm going a bit crazy with the terraforming here, but hear me out. We've tackled some biomes so far that are typically super flat, including the plains and the desert. So I thought, why not give you guys some really cool landscape to explore in the jungle? Since I wanted to create a super intricate landscape to really immerse you guys in your jungle adventures, I actually spent 2 weeks making manual edits to this terrain to get it just right, as this was before I learnt some of the terrain tools that you'll see me using in later chapters. There will be plenty of secrets to explore, including a custom abandoned mineshaft with its own ores featuring later in this chapter, along with literally dozens of custom caves and dungeons, which will be coming in the finishing touches chapter. I added tons of variety to these mountains and made them very dynamic, decorating them with plenty of caves, rocky overhangs and steep cliffs. To break up the mountain range even further, I mapped out a route for plenty of valleys, rivers and waterfalls that connect back into the ocean surrounding the ultimate survival world. And of course, I made a big stone island for our jungle temple to sit on. Speaking of water, with our landscaping complete, I started filling up our valleys with blue wool, which would eventually become the various rivers and waterfalls of the jungle valley. Now I've used this technique before on the channel, and it's the best possible way to achieve some really nice looking waterfalls and rivers without Minecraft's water physics breaking through and filling up the entire map. To finish off our shiny new jungle landscape, I added grass, moss and plenty of foliage to add a little life to the basic terrain. And as you can see, compared to the size of my character, this place is huge. But it's still very empty, and jungles are typically known for being, well, the complete opposite of that. So to turn our epic landscape into an actual jungle, I created a few variations of palm trees and jungle trees, an assortment of shrubs, plants and bushes to add greenery to the jungle floor, and of course some custom boulders and rocks. Now, I had to start in true Jumanji style and create some giant statues to guard the entrance of what will soon be a legendary ancient city. To give you guys some context, the jaguar was worshipped in Mayan culture, and it's often associated with power, bravery, and foresight. Similarly, this jungle civilization built a pair of these powerful figures to not only protect their city, as they worshipped the jaguar for saving them from a horde of giant jungle spiders. The jaguars also encouraged the worthy to tackle the maze, empowered by these symbols of foresight and bravery watching over them. We'll return to this mysterious maze of the jaguar shortly, but with our jaguar statue almost complete, I made a few small tweaks before repositioning it either side of this gap between the mountains. To kick off this ancient city, we need to upgrade the vanilla jungle temple that's going to sit smack bang in the middle of it. Of course, I had to listen to you guys and take inspiration from Mayan, Incan, and Aztec architecture for this one. Remember though, these creations aren't meant to be accurate to real life, and if you don't see your favourite cultures or architectural styles in this world, you definitely will when I make the next one. Anyhow, I transformed the original temple, attempting to incorporate a similar style and size. Well, actually, this isn't the whole thing. This is just the top of the temple. I guess I lied to you about the size. Since the jungle temple has been tackled in Minecraft so many times before, even by me, I tried to create something unique for this world, incorporating lots of different elements to each layer of the building. So, what did this intricate temple mean to the ancient jungle city? Well, every year, many of the city's people would undertake a perilous pilgrimage across the vast jungle landscape, searching for the 4 elemental protector totems. At each totem, they would leave valuable offerings and perform rituals to preserve the power of the sacred elements, which were essential for the city's survival. After finding earth, wind, fire and water, the pilgrimage would finish at the temple, and those who succeeded were celebrated in a grand ceremony as saviors of the city and were provided with many valuable benefits for the next year. And that wraps up the exterior of our jungle temple transformation. And so, to tie our temple to its equally grand surroundings, I did some terraforming to make some space for the main bridge to the city, creating walkways to connect things up, as well as some more foundations around the base of the temple to support this massive structure. Out the front of the temple, I created this Mayan-inspired statue head that will act as a water duct. I added some streams that filter off through these stone channels and out the mouth of these abstract faces to add a really magical vibe to the temple. For the interior of our giant new jungle temple, I was able to include many walkways, balconies, and other areas for you guys to explore with plenty of hidden loot, thanks to the multiple levels of this structure. As you can imagine, this temple was hugely important to our jungle civilization, being fundamental to many of their rituals and ceremonies. It's even rumoured that the Jungle King is buried deep within the temple with his most precious possessions, protected by dozens of booby traps. Also, you may recognise the villager head statues from a previous USW chapter. Given the plethora of sacred artifacts found in our ancient jungle city, there are many tales of adventurers who travelled here, including members of the merchant family from our woodland mansion. In fact, you may have spotted that they had orchestrated a grand heist to steal a sacred statue from the city, which still remains in their mansion to this day. And it's rumoured that this was the source of their bad luck and eventual disappearance. Anyway, with the temple finally complete, I headed back outside and made room for the only way in and out of this city, the Maze of the Jaguar. For this legendary maze, I was inspired by the Labyrinth, famous in Greek mythology for playing host to the monstrous Minotaur. I love combining inspirations from many influences since there are no rules in Minecraft, and it gives me a chance to be as inclusive as possible. This jungle maze was designed to test the bravery of those seeking entrance to the ancient jungle city, and it is said to be enchanted, leading to many unworthy adventurers becoming insane before finding the exit. I wonder if you and your friends are worthy of entering the ancient city. Plus, in the centre of the maze, I incorporated the first of the 4 elemental totems that are hidden across the city. Perhaps you can find them all and discover their secrets. This earth totem was created to keep the ground fertile, bringing the people a good harvest and protecting the land from natural disaster. However, to keep these protections alive, the elemental totems required offerings, hence the pilgrimage undertaken by the jungle folk. Unfortunately, one year, a desperate thief took on the pilgrimage, stealing her offerings from her fellow people in hope that she would enjoy a comfortable life the next year. Her deception tainted the rituals, and the protection provided by the totems for centuries was tarnished. Eventually, the city dwellers could find no fertile land, their water was contaminated, and their hunting ventures always ended in fatalities. The elements were totally against them, and a devastating elemental storm broke out, leaving the entire city abandoned. Now, with all of this talk of an ancient city, I'd better start building it, hadn't I? Remember though, this is all just a supplement to my jungle temple transformation. The actual vanilla village upgrade is totally separate. Anyhow, to start things off, I added a bunch of platforms and additional bridges around the mountainscape to start plotting out the city's foundations. I also added some of the larger infrastructural buildings at this stage, which you can discover when you explore the map yourselves. Just imagine finding this hidden deep within the jungle. This seriously is an adventurous playground. So guys, this particular building is super special. You may recall that the desert and jungle biomes have always had a solid trading relationship. Well, the two civilizations created a huge mining network alongside those native to the Mesa and the dwarves of the Deep Dark, with a giant tunnel network connecting their biomes underground to transfer ores and other resources to one another. This building is the grand entrance to the USW's inter-biome mining network, and I can't wait for you guys to explore it for yourselves. Next up on my agenda was to brighten things up a little bit, so I whipped up this huge fire brazier, which rages on to indicate that the unruly elements still curse the land. I then created a couple of standard designs to assist with tackling the large area, including a basic building and pillar design to kick things off. I then placed the fire braziers either side of the jungle valley and a couple of the standard buildings elsewhere, before moving on to plan out where I would place the city's main buildings using my classic red wool technique. And of course, it was then time to populate the city with the smaller buildings where our city folk used to live. In its heyday, this city was self-sufficient, bustling with inhabitants. They had their own military, prison, library, and more. Rather than spoiling all the fun now, I'll let you guys explore them properly for yourselves. Last but not least, I had to add that custom mine I promised you guys, where the jungle sources its valuable 1.17 ores. Now you know why the desert was so keen to have good trade links with the jungle. Anyhow, as you can see, I created a large lift and crane for moving materials around, since the whole city is spread across this mountainscape. I added in an entrance to some custom caves, where the ancient city folk did their mining back in the day. I wonder if there are any shiny 1.17 resources left to be found in here. With the ancient city complete, which was really all just a massive jungle temple transformation with lots of added extras, I placed down the trees and shrubs that we created earlier to bring it to life. And to really add that jungle vibe, I added some giant hanging vines across the whole city. And that just about completes the USW's legendary ancient jungle city. I suppose it's time to move on to the rest of the biome. Scattered around the jungle, I decided to place 3 small temples for you guys to discover. These temples were built by the survivors who fled the ancient city during the elemental storm, restoring their spiritual connection to their gods and helping to ward off the jungle spiders. Before transforming the jungle village, I populated more of our vast jungle with the trees, shrubs and rock clusters that we made earlier. As you can see, I left a clear area to do some terraforming for the village transformation, where the survivors of the elemental storm now reside. I created a large lake and waterfall feeding into some winding rivers that lead out into the ocean. To plan out the transformation, I placed down the original vanilla village around the new landscape and mapped out the pathways and bridges. One of the most requested features from you guys for the USW jungle was tree houses, so I just had to include some for you guys. Taking inspiration from the vanilla village buildings, I created 2 alternative treehouse designs to sit up high in the canopies of our jungle trees. I then scattered them across the village, connecting them up with thin, rickety bridges to create a treetop network above the ground-based village. The ground-based village was feeling a little short of bridges now, so of course I added the bridges that I'd planned out below too. And to finally kick off the profession buildings, I began with the cleric. Similarly to my plains cleric, I decided to go with an alternative building design, given the mystical items that the cleric trades. So I took the wagon that I made for the plains biome and adapted it to house our jungle's wandering voodoo doctor. No one ever sees the wagon arrive or leave, and its bizarre, rickety structure seems to defy all physics. But no one asks any questions, since our voodoo doctor is a little prone to casting hexes on those who snoop. He does make great herbal tea though. 5 stars on Uber Eats. Next up, I transformed the Fletcher's building. I opted for a relatively simple design on a diagonal, with plenty of targets and firing ranges to test out the latest arrows. He also holds free archery classes for the kids on Wednesdays. And finally, for our butcher/farmer, I created a quaint little jungle farmhouse and a small farmyard to wrap up the profession buildings. Now, since our village was still extremely empty at this point, I transformed some default vanilla houses to place around. I tried to stick as closely as possible to the vanilla designs, to make this as authentic an upgrade as possible, given how carried away I got with the ancient jungle city. So you may remember from earlier that there were several tribes inhabiting the jungle, one of which was made up of the survivors of the elemental curse in the ancient city. Over centuries, these tribes lived in territorial conflict with one another, but eventually they agreed to live in harmony. They created a new community which has thrived ever since in the form of this charming jungle village. Now, for those of you who've been listening carefully, you might remember that a plague broke out in the north of the Darkwood Forest near the coast. Those who escaped the zombie-infested village fled to the main Darkwood village, but were turned away, as the villagers were terrified of catching the plague. The stranded survivors fled across the river to the edge of the jungle, turning to a life of pillaging and scavenging to survive. The survivors began to clear an area, destroying the trees to create a new settlement, threatening the newfound peace in the jungle. Perhaps you guys can make it your quest to cleanse the zombie village of the plague and save the jungle from the threat of the pillagers too. And so, with all of that building and lore covered, let's take a look at the completed USW jungle. To kick things off, I decided to do a little bit more terraforming than I first planned for this biome. I wanted this biome to feel like an enhanced version of how this kind of environment looks in the real world, with plenty of stacks to break up the landscape to make for some more exciting survival exploration and adventures. And as usual, I spent far too long fiddling with the terraforming, since the main goal here is to make sure you guys are fully immersed in this world. Eventually, after many hours of tweaking and adding cacti instead of classic old broccoli trees, I was happy with the environment and ready to move the vanilla town out of the way to upgrade it. And yes, I had to add my own vanilla town since the Mesa doesn't spawn its own naturally. Bit rude of Mojang to leave them out really. Now, to start on our village, which will actually be based on my interpretation of a Wild West town, I'm building our first building, which is the weaponsmith. When planning this village, Steph and I realised that so many professions suit this biome, which led us to incorporating a whole bunch of building types, some of them corresponding with in-game Minecraft professions, and others based on what sprung to our minds when we thought about the Wild West. As you can see, I've tackled both the weaponsmith and toolsmith Minecraft professions, mainly from a more realistic, practical standpoint, but also because I love the idea of a steampunk Wild West. Imagine all of the cool steampunk mining tools that they could create. Next up, I just had to include a leather worker. Honestly, I don't think I can imagine a single Wild West scene in my head without copious amounts of leather involved. I topped off the building with a little water tower and scattered some barrels, another Wild West staple for some decoration. Now, to honour Minecraft's dungeons, I had to incorporate a little jail into our western town, along with a classic sheriff's office. Having said that, this town was actually founded by a group of outlaws, who journeyed across the USW's biomes, wreaking havoc for years, before invading the Mesa and settling there, destroying the resident wolf tribe's village and chasing them away to the Savanna. I'll let Steph tell you more about the lore in her USW movie series. But for now, let's continue with these village buildings. As you can see, I decided to get a bit more colourful for our bank and hotel buildings, and if you look at real Wild West towns, some of them were actually pretty colourful too. I decided to add a bit of height variation with the hotels as well, and I am of course doing all the interiors. I'm just not going to show you guys, since I don't want to ruin the surprise for when you play the map for yourselves. Before you start panicking, don't worry. We are of course building a saloon. Our resident outlaws definitely deserve a drink after all that looting and pillaging. Well, maybe they don't, but there's no way I could deny our Mesa miners a cold drink when they come to visit. Just wait until you see where they have to work every day. For our place of worship in this biome, I took a little bit of inspiration from history and included a church. Having said that, a lot of old western towns didn't have the luxury of a dedicated church building, and some services were even held in the saloon. And finally, to finish up our village buildings, I created a little house. I envisioned a lot of our villagers having sleeping quarters above their businesses, but there is one house. I wonder who lives here. I wonder if they have a story. Now it's finally time to place all of our buildings, sticking to a classic cul-de-sac style of placement, which I think we all typically associate with Wild West towns. Real western towns often look quite different to this movie-like interpretation, but they did often run parallel to a railroad, which we'll bring to life in the next segment of this build. To decorate the village, I of course had to include a water tower. Water towers were actually used to supply water for steam trains along the railroad lines, so they're much more than just a cool looking decoration. To go hand in hand with the water tower, I built a windmill. These windmills were actually used to pump water, which would be stored in the water towers, and that's why you often see them depicted together. I also built a stagecoach, which would have been used to transport passengers from place to place, and came up with a couple of smaller wagon designs, a well, a stack of barrels, and some gallows. Perhaps a little morbid, but often history can be. And to finish up this segment of the build, I scattered the decorations around our Wild West town. I think these finishing touches really bring a build to life. Now it's time to move on to our railroad network. To link this up nicely to the village, I whipped up a station and a platform and included another water tower close by to make sure our trains have plenty of access to water. That is what steam trains run on after all. I added in some decorations, the beginnings of a very long track, and incorporated a classic railroad tunnel as a finishing touch. Obviously, I had to build a train to ride these tracks, so I built a little steam train. Now since this is all survival friendly and on a relatively small scale, this was quite a challenge, but I'm really happy with how this turned out. I added the finer details, including the various stacks and domes on top, and the pilot, which is often known as a cowcatcher, at the front, before moving back to build the cab. After making lots of tweaks to the front of the train, I built a coal cart to follow closely behind the cab, ready to fuel it up, and then I built some carriages for passengers behind to finish this first train up. Since I'm building such a huge railroad, I really had to build another train to go round it. I copied the same design for the front, but this time designing the carriages for transporting materials and goods rather than passengers. You'll notice the gold and coal in the back of the carriages, which have been transported from the huge mines that we'll be tackling shortly. Before we move on to the mines though, we have an enormous railroad to tackle. And of course, rather than making this easy for myself, I plotted out a route that winds around the whole canyon, making twists and turns and taking diagonal routes across the landscape. It literally took hours for Steph and I to plot out this route, but it was definitely worth it. The whole canyon has been brought to life. Now, since this track is so expansive and we have 2 trains heading around it, I had to incorporate another station with a little water stop to get our trains more water, since early steam trains would need to stop for more water every couple of hours depending on their journey and load. To support our huge railroad, I created a trestle bridge, inspired by the Goat Canyon Trestle in California. Timber trestle bridges not only have an iconic look, but they were usually seen as a more temporary structure, which is why I chose to use them here. I really wanted this canyon to seem as though it is in its prime, bustling with new activity in the USW's own mini gold rush period. Trestle bridges are actually very strong, which is why similar designs have been used for wooden roller coasters over the years. Luckily, I was able to create a more modular trestle bridge design to support the railroad, although I did have to manually build the corner pieces, which took quite a long time, but it was definitely worth investing the time because these bridges really elevate the landscape to a whole new level. And after the painstaking process of finalising the trestle bridge design around the entire railroad, it's time to move on from our train network and head to the mines. To kick off the mines, I took my crane design from the jungle's mines and placed it down in the canyon, which may seem odd at first, but hear me out. When the outlaws took over the Mesa, they were mostly driven by greed, having heard that the land was full of gold and valuable resources. When they first came to the canyon to begin mining the land, they discovered an ancient tunnel, which led to the inter-biome mining network. This ancient network connects several biomes via giant underground tunnels. You may remember me mentioning it when we tackled the jungle. So, the crane design here is the same as the jungle's because the outlaws travel to the ancient jungle city, stealing the crane design for their own mines and saving themselves lots of planning time. Let's just hope that they haven't stolen all of the jungle mines resources by the time that you get to play the map for yourselves. Anyway, as you can see, I'm building several overhanging mining buildings on stilts, incorporating a lift with several different levels so that the miners can move resources around easily, mainly refining coal and gold, ready to be transported around the USW. With all of these extra buildings, this is really shaping up to be a little mining town of its own. One building I really loved creating was this sluicing mine. This method of mining is often depicted with an exaggerated building with crazy pipes all over the roof, and it's something I remember seeing as a kid. Steph said it's from Club Penguin, but I digress. Sluicing uses sloping water channels to break down the earth containing gold. So our Mesa miners will be beavering away in the caves, dumping a mixture of gold and earth into their mine carts and sending it up for the sluicing to get the end product. But of course, there are different materials and methods being used across these mines. So a larger crane was definitely necessary here. Now we haven't yet tackled the pillager outpost, and I thought that it would be a great addition to the mines. The Mesa is home to the outlaws anyway, so you would certainly expect to see a few outposts and watchtowers overseeing their precious mines. To keep some consistency between the outposts across different biomes, just like vanilla Minecraft, I repurposed the outpost I created for the plains, redesigning the roof in a more western style and changing up some of the materials and finer details to differentiate it further. I then added a more temporary campsite for those stationed at this watchtower, as they would have different duties to the miners and would likely move from outpost to outpost, since I placed another 2 around the mining canyon. Since there are going to be so many materials and supplies coming in and out of this mining area, I knew that I had to add in an extra train station here, just next to the outpost so that the workers can easily catch a train back to town if need be. And finally, to create our actual gold mines. Now, without giving too much away, I've dug out several tunnels weaving through the canyon, incorporating a whole minecart track network as well. It's honestly like a miniature roller coaster. If only mining was this fun in real life. To finish up this area, I added in some stairs to connect up to the cranes so that our Mesa miners can operate them without clambering up the side of the canyon. I also incorporated some extra platforms and pathways, creating a dock area near the water's edge to provide another means of transporting goods from the area, with another dock at the town to receive goods and send out supplies. To come up with some final decorations, I copied some of the wagon designs from the main town, changing their contents to dynamite and ores gathered from the mines. Then, I built a custom wagon to transport a larger load of dynamite and TNT, before finally creating a smaller crane based on a previous design that I made to load and offload goods around the dock area. I scattered these decorations across the mining canyon and placed down 2 steamboats that I previously designed from my survival series with Steph. I also mixed in raw gold, iron and coal blocks into the piles of barrels, just to add a little variation. And with that, the Mesa is complete. The Savanna tends to be a pretty forgotten biome, and it has definitely been the biome I've received the least ideas for. So I thought we'd do it some justice and create something really special. I can't be sending you guys to sleep now, can I? To kick things off, I of course had to upgrade our Savanna trees, taking inspiration from African acacia trees so we can achieve that classic Lion King horizon. I created a few different variations to keep things nice and organic, eventually removing the vanilla trees and placing our custom ones across the entire biome. I also placed some custom boulder clusters to change up the environment. I really am getting those Lion King vibes now. And as you can see, our environment is now freshly upgraded and ready to be filled with some crazy builds. I started by plotting out our cattle field with a custom fence, being sure to make plenty of room for our cows to graze. I also included a classic ranch entrance sign to fit with the rest of the Mesa buildings, before relocating this to the actual entrance of the ranch and plotting out some pathways, along with some coloured wool foundation plans for all of the ranch's buildings. Next up, I tackled Crazy Pete's house. He's got to have a cozy home to relax in after a long day on the ranch. Steph did the interior for this one, and apparently he has a beer tap above his sink rather than a regular tap. I guess that's why she's named him Crazy Pete. Then I whipped up this large barn, building it on a diagonal to keep things from looking too regimented before bringing over a couple of decorations from the Mesa town, including the water pumping windmill and the water tower to accompany it, since we don't want our animals getting too thirsty. They can't survive on beer alone like Crazy Pete. And of course, I couldn't forget to add in some stables. You guys were sad not seeing them in the Mesa, so of course I wanted to dedicate a part of the ranch to the stables, incorporating the stable hand's house on the end. Now to finish up our ranch, I created this cattle shed in a classic cartoon-like barn style, with a small outcropping for feeding, as well as another windmill and water tower to make sure the cows' water troughs are kept nice and full. Now these Mesa folk are getting a little close to the Savanna. Tensions are certainly rising, but hey, at least the animals are happy. Not too far from the ranch, we're going to be building our wolf tribe, taking some inspiration from the Native Americans. Typically, what we often see depicted in movies and stories is based around the Native Americans of the plains. No, not the plains in Minecraft. This plains was between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. These people were known for dwelling in teepees and wearing elaborate feather bonnets, which I think we all tend to think of as the main symbols of the Native Americans. Now I love that imagery, but I don't think many people know how diverse the Native Americans were. Historians actually divide them into 10 separate culture areas. They lived in very different dwellings and had different cultures depending on where they resided. In the southwest, the environment was much like our USW's Mesa, and the people there lived in mud and stone houses called pueblos and hogans. On the flip side, the Inuit and Aleut peoples lived in what is now modern-day Alaska and Canada, in a contrasting environment, living very different lives to the farmers of the plains or the southwest. To somewhat reflect this diversity, I wanted to take inspiration from some of these different building types in the Wolf Tribe's village. Now, the Wolf Tribe originally resided in the Mesa, where their houses were more like the pueblos and hogans I mentioned earlier. To kick things off in a recognisable style, I whipped up a couple of totem poles to sit either side of the Wolf Tribe's entrance, with several different totems carved into the wood. These 3 totems are important symbols for the tribe. Anyway, I quickly got to work on the tribe's teepees, creating a few different variations to dot around the camp. I also incorporated some glazed terracotta into my designs, since teepees are traditionally painted with depictions of battles, personal experiences, and even animals. Since I couldn't incorporate actual paintings on the teepees in vanilla Minecraft, I thought the terracotta was a good replacement to add some detail and colour. For the rest of the tribe's main houses, I whipped up a wigwam and longhouse, which would have typically been viewed as a pretty symbolic building, representing territory being shared across nations. In the USW, the Wolf Tribe's longhouse represents their ancient allegiances with the desert and the jungle. And since our Wolf Tribe is based around a lake, I thought it would be pretty appropriate to include these chickies elevated above the wet ground to provide a cozy, dry dwelling for the villagers. In Native American culture, it was very common for the children to learn the workings of the camp at a young age with first-hand experiences. So I thought it'd be cool to incorporate a mini camp for the Wolf Tribe's children to hang out, where they can learn to tend to the fire, look after animals, grow their own crops, and even practice their archery. And with our various buildings complete, I scattered them across the camp, and now things are really starting to come to life. Remember, all of these buildings will have interiors too. I'm just not going to spoil the surprise. To guard the front entrance from those pesky Mesa outlaws, I created a couple of basic, stilted watchtowers, peeking up over the large fence to keep an eye out for suspicious visitors. And you also may have noticed the large space that I left at the back of the camp, which is of course for the chief's hut. I was inspired by the wattle and daub style of building for this hut, as I wanted to create something completely different to the rest of the buildings to give the tribe a special place to gather before the chief. I think it actually ended up looking pretty similar to the large Dothraki hut from Game of Thrones, still fitting nicely with the theme of the camp. Just to one side of the chief's hut, I created a communal fire pit area for the villagers to gather around and included a warning bell as well as a small stables to keep a few horses. And to add some finishing touches before tackling the most important part of the camp, I added in some bridges to connect the islands scattered across the winding lake, created some areas for farming crops near the water, built a little fishing dock jutting out into the lake, hung some banners at the entrance in the tribe's very own colours, and finally added in some small totem poles either side of the entrance to the chief's hut, perhaps even including a hidden booby trap or two to ward off you Minecraft adventurers from seeking entrance to the hut. Now this tree is not just an important spiritual tree for the wolf tribe, but a fundamental part of the USW's backstory. You may remember that the wolf tribe fled to the Savanna from the Mesa, chasing out the residents of this camp and claiming it as their own, in desperation to escape the Mesa outlaws. The original residents were known as the Bone Tribe, who we'll visit later on. The Bone Tribe's healer created magical medicines from plants and bones, and had left behind a mysterious pouch when the wolf tribe took over the camp. The pouch contained a strange powder, and the wolf tribe soon discovered that it made things grow at rapid speed. It was bone meal. The wolf tribe believed in a spiritual connection with nature, and in an important ritual, the camp's elders were to plant a sacred sapling to strengthen the tribe's bond to nature and provide them with a special place for future rituals and worship. Realizing that the magical bone meal could bring their spirit tree to life quickly, they used it to grow it to full size. Inadvertently, the camp's elders had created a strong spiritual connection between the wolf tribe and the bone tribe, bringing this bond to life in a magical tree which grew from a combination of important ingredients from each tribe. The spirit tree called out to the wolf tribe chief, as well as the elders, encouraging them to reconcile with the bone tribe after they had forced them out of their home. The two tribes were now linked through nature. It was fate that their paths would cross, and if they were to stand a chance against the ever-expanding Mesa outlaws, their alliance was essential. But anyway, I won't give too much away for now. And that's our wolf tribe complete. I love how this turned out, and it's such a unique little area to explore. I can't wait for you guys to come across it during your Minecraft adventures. And now it's time to head over to the other side of the Savanna to find out where the Bone Tribe has got to. Now this is where the building gets serious. We're jumping right in at the deep end here, creating a gigantic quarry for our Bone Tribe to live in. This quarry was used by the Bone Tribe for simply mining resources. But when the Wolf Tribe were forced to seek sanctuary in the Savanna, the Bone Tribe fled here. But what on earth did they do with all of this space? If you've seen the USW movie series, then you'll know that the USW was once home to many primeval creatures which the first people of the island fought off. The Bone Tribe received their name from their legendary bone armor, forged by their ancestors from a giant primeval creature that they eliminated when it posed a threat to their people. Legend has it that the enormous animal fed the tribe for weeks, and the bones of its body were used to forge their armor, but the skull was never found. And as you can see, the rumors were true after all. Centuries later, the descendants of the Bone Tribe discovered the skull when excavating a large quarry to mine for materials near the Savanna's hills, and it became their salvation at their most desperate time of need. In fact, the Bone Tribe actually view this giant beast's skull as a sacred blessing from their ancestors. When the Wolf Tribe were chased out of their home by the outlaws that now reside in the Mesa, the Bone Tribe lost their home too. They fled to the quarry, where they'd recently uncovered this gigantic skull, which none of the tribe ever really knew was more than a myth. They hid inside the skull, and it kept them safe, sheltered them from the elements, and concealed them from attackers while they were still vulnerable. It later became the hub for their tribe, and they actually dedicated different parts of the skull to different purposes. For instance, the inside of the creature's cranium is their equivalent to a main headquarters, where the real thinking happens. But we'll turn to these dedicated parts of the skull a little later. And with this gigantic skull complete, it's time to place it in the quarry. It makes a pretty epic centerpiece, but what exactly are we going to build, and where? Steph and I spent a long time planning all of the different building types that incorporate bones in an unusual way. From 2-story huts to crazy towers with bone mechanics, we color-coded each structure and decided where to place them across the quarry. This process actually took hours and hours, but it was definitely worth it to make sure everything fitted together coherently. And now for the exciting part, creating these bony buildings, incorporating giant bone and horn supports in as many different ways as possible. For the buildings themselves, I didn't want to use any one specific reference. There is so much variation in African architecture, which we wanted to incorporate into some of our buildings, whilst focusing on coming up with a unique architectural style that suits these crazy surroundings. I did, however, want to make sure that everything was intentional and meaningful. As you know, we love to incorporate plenty of story and symbolism here on the TrixyBlox channel. So we decided to use the colour red as the tribe's main colour, drawing inspiration from the Maasai tribe of Kenya, who wear a vibrant cloth known as a shahuka. Red is considered a sacred colour by the Maasai, also representing blood, and it is the basic colour for all shahuka. Similarly, the Bone tribe adopted the red colour as a warning to potential attackers, but also as a celebration of their sacred home, centred around the skull that saved them from a terrible fate. As you might have noticed, I also incorporated this building, which is actually a mini upgrade of Minecraft's vanilla pillager outpost. I wanted to challenge myself to actually downscale a Minecraft structure rather than upscaling it, since the goal here is to transform the entirety of Minecraft after all. So why not try achieving that in different, more challenging ways? We thought it'd be really interesting to combine an ordinary village with some pillager outpost elements. Now this is going to be a village in the map, spawning villagers as opposed to pillagers, but this little pillager reference shows the tribe's fighting spirit and doubles as a mini outpost upgrade for the Savanna. And with the first small buildings finished, I placed them around the quarry, following the colour-coded plan that we laid out earlier, and making a few adjustments to the landscape here and there. Now, for our first and most obvious profession building, the Armourer. We can't exactly have a tribe fabled for their bone armour without an actual Armourer building. For this particular building, I took some inspiration from the huts of the Dorza in Ethiopia, incorporating some different elements to ensure the building suits its surroundings and showcases the Bone tribe's colour. With the Armourer building done, I placed it down before moving on to the Healer's hut. Now you may remember me mentioning the Healer earlier in this video, and she's a very important part of the tribe. In our world, it is a belief in traditional South African Ndebele society that illness is caused by spells or curses. So there would be a healer to combat these forces, known as a Sangama or Inyaga, depending on their area of speciality. They often use herbs and bones in their rituals, and this is pretty common still. In fact, it's actually estimated that these healers, who are essentially shamans, are about 8 times more common than conventional doctors in South Africa. How cool is that? Now, since our healer primarily uses plants in her practices, her hut is actually our unconventional farmer's building of the tribe. So I created a little area for crops, which the healer uses for her medicines, and a small grazing area for some sheep. I also added these little green and yellow banners, taking further inspiration from the Maasai tribe, who believe that yellow and green colours are said to bring nourishment and growth. The Bone tribe's healer painted these banners herself, placing them around her crop field as lucky charms. It certainly worked, because this is the only fertile land in the quarry. Next up is the cartographer's building, which I use the healer's hut as our foundation for. With these bony buildings, it was really useful to take some inspiration from World of Warcraft's orc buildings, but I also tried to include some original concepts too, and I'm pretty chuffed with how this turned out. I thought it'd be cool to include a lift, taking the cartographer up to the lookout tower, using this rotating bone mechanism at the top to act as a pulley system. And of course, I had to fiddle with the design a little further once I placed the building, adding an extra little tower at the top to finish it off. Now, our Bone King resides on the left side of the skull in the district where the elders reside. His tower had to be something a little special, so I started with a sturdy base, incorporating bone supports for the main structure and the roof too. I wanted this building to really embrace the Bone tribe's traditions, so I was sure to embed the largest bones of any building in the quarry in its structure, creating a grand tower for the tribe's leader to reside in. I placed the Bone King's grand tower down, connecting it to the Elders District with a bridge. I also created a bridge across to the skull's right eye, as this is where the Elders conduct their rituals, through which they gain insight from their ancestors. Through this path, they can reach their meeting hall based in the cranium, since that's where all the thinking happens. And they can also reach the other eye too, which is the Elders' viewing platform, giving them a view across the rest of the tribe. In fact, each part of the skull is used in a way reminiscent of how the creature would have used that part back when it was alive. The eyes represent sight, hence the rituals and viewing balcony. The mouth contains a grand feasting hall, and the head contains the Elder's headquarters. And you'll soon see what the nose is used for. I thought it would make sense to add one final profession building, the stonemason. I just built a deep slate foundation for the Bone King's tower and realised that it made a lot of sense for the stonemason to have a similar building style. So I whipped up this round, bony mini tower, which is clearly built from deep slate carved by the stonemason himself. I set the stonemason's building down in its pre-planned spot before adding in some more bridges, an elevator, finalising some platforms and placing pathways. And of course, our bone tribe needs some protection at its front entrance. So I created a large, square watchtower to sit either side of the grand entrance, incorporating a spiky, menacing design, as well as some bones and red banners to tie it into the rest of the tribe. I then placed down the watchtower either side of the entrance as planned, incorporating these huge bones to frame the entrance, almost like you're walking through part of a ribcage when entering the quarry. Next, I add a little protection around the front with a fence, the same one as the fence from the Wolf Tribe. I mean, it was originally the Bone Tribe's fence before they were pushed out after all. The Wolf Tribe didn't even build it, so I think we can forgive them for using it for their new home. Now, to tick another Minecraft structure off our transformation list, I decided to create some smaller scale skulls and some rib cages, recreating vanilla Minecraft fossils to act as some decoration for our bone tribe. I created 2 smaller skull variants, a large rib cage, as well as a campsite, some market stalls for the tribe's trading, a few fire brazier variants, and of course some rock and ore piles, since this is a quarry after all. After coming up with these decorations, I dotted them around the quarry, even creating a rib cage camp at the quarry floor. I also thought that it'd be cool to flip the rib cage up the other way, to create a more sheltered outdoor area next to the Bone King's tower. Now he and the elders can enjoy their garden parties, whatever the weather. It's really crazy how much this quarry comes to life with all the final decorations, especially the fire braziers. But to add a little more functionality for the Bone Tribe folk, I dotted some cranes around, making it easier for all the heavy materials to be hauled around the various levels of the quarry. And to add a few more details, I whipped up some canopies for supplies, and added a couple of camps just past the quarry border, where the tribe's hunters and foragers are stationed. And last but not least, we're finally discovering what the tribe uses the skull's nose for. When the tribe were forced to flee their home by the Wolf Tribe, which was really all thanks to the outlaws, the tribe hid inside the skull. When they lit their first fire, it was fundamental to their survival, and the camp kept that fire alight no matter what. The elders ordered that the 2 things that had enabled their survival should be unified, and that the flame of the Great Fire should never dwindle. The fire now resides in the skull's nostrils as a constant beacon of hope, said to breathe life into the camp. The tribe also tells stories from the Great Fire's smoke, including the tale of their ancestors' epic battle with the giant creature, whose skull provides the foundation to their tribe today. The camp's designated firekeepers keep the flame alive, which is actually not dissimilar to the traditions of the Himba tribe, situated in Namibia. Their holy fire is called the Okaruwa, which they must keep burning, the smoke of which they believe connects them to their ancestors. To add the final touches, I scattered some grass, trees and rocks around the edge of the quarry to blend things with the rest of the biome nicely. And that just about wraps up our bone tribe. This is probably one of the most unique builds in the entire USW, and definitely makes for an epic spot for an adventure. So let's take a look at everything that we've built in our upgraded Savanna biome. Now, if you guys have been paying attention to the other chapters, you may remember me mentioning that several of the biome's people made pacts, and even had complex trading relationships. This cave is actually home to the hub of the inter-biome mining network, where the indigenous people of the desert, mesa, and jungle banded together to strengthen their collective resources via a complex network of mines. What I didn't mention was that this hub is also the home of an entire civilization of people and the fourth members of the Alliance, the USW's dwarves. With the shell of the cave complete, you can spot plenty of 1.17 and 1.18 elements here, with the giant dripstone stalagmites, glowberries, spore blossoms, and more. This is the ultimate lush cave to start our epic transformation in. Now first and foremost, let's start with our giant dwarf statue, since this vast cave is their home, and they were the ones to establish the epic lush ancient city we're going to be tackling today. Little is known about the origins of the dwarves, but they were outcast by those inhabiting the surface, leading them to seek sanctuary underground. It was a long time before the dwarves made contact with the surface dwellers again, but when they did, the kindness of the Jungle King led them to a strong alliance, which eventually led to the inter-biome mining network forming. Without the dwarves, the surface biomes would have struggled to prosper as they have, so it's fitting that this dwarf statue feeds the cave with its only lava source, essential for the smelting of materials mined from the cave network. To finalise our grand dwarf statue, I incorporated plenty of deep slate variations to tie in with the deep dark theme, which will become much more apparent when we tackle the rest of the city. I also gave the dwarfs some weapons, which actually represent one of the two factions of the city, which we'll explore more later on. The Copper faction was known as the fiercer faction of the dwarves, renowned for their resilience and survival abilities. To honour the sacrifices they made to protect the entire dwarven race, the Amethyst faction, who were the more innovative of the dwarves, built this statue bearing two weapons said to be wielded by the Copper faction's eldest ancestors. I think he makes for an awesome centerpiece of the forge area. With our dwarf statue complete, it's time to set it in place and get started on the next statues. If you've been following the TrixyBlox channel for a while, you might remember my underground kingdom. This mega build was my first major project, and I really wanted to include some sort of reference to it in these caves. So I took the Atlas inspired statue I created for the underground kingdom and improved on it, to act as the basis for our founder statues. As you can see, the two statues look pretty different to each other, and I definitely think the new one is a major improvement. Using the foundations we just built, I added the finer details to the Jungle King statue. The Jungle King was also key to the creation of this inter-biome mining network, so he sits between the dwarf statue and the other statues, since it was his diplomacy that bridged the gap between the dwarves and the people inhabiting the surface. With the Jungle King statue complete, I place him down in front of the dwarf statue before moving on to our final two founder statues. To meet the lava channels that we're going to be placing, these statues need to be a little lower, so I tweaked the same Underground Kingdom statue into a kneeling position before getting started with the finer details. Then, to tackle the Pharaoh statue, I built his headdress and added some clothing and jewellery to set him apart from the other statues. You may have also noticed the gemstones I have placed in the head of each statue, which is just a little representation of their home biomes. And for the Wolf Tribe Chief, I tried my best to recreate a feather war bonnet, which was pretty tricky using just Minecraft blocks on this scale, but I think it turned out looking pretty cool. And with the final Founders statues complete, it's time to incorporate them into the smelting area of the forge. As you can see, our Jungle King is supporting the main lava channel, which sloped down into the back of our Wolf Tribe Chief and Pharaoh statues. Now, whilst I really wanted this part of the build to be a crazy centerpiece that does the USW's lore some justice, I also wanted to make sure that it made some sense as a practical element of the build. So the front statues are each feeding a large basin of lava that they carry, which heats a vat attached above it. This way, all of the gold mined from the cave networks can be brought here and smelted, before transporting to the main forge. But we'll tackle all of those logistical elements later. These huge statues were a great way to kick off this cave upgrade, and I love how they tie the lore of the Ultimate Survival world into this transformation. Before completing the forge area, we need to lay out the city entrance and the city itself. To mirror the thin corridors and multi-leveled elements in the vanilla ancient city, I created these narrow staircases to connect the upper and lower platforms of the entrance and trading area, adding some basic crenellations to start off with. I then started to work on the first of the 3 biome entrances with a chain and cog system to work the doors. Well, we'll use our imagination and pretend that they work the doors. I played with the gear design for a while before settling on a style and embedding it in the wall either side of the entrance. As you may have guessed, this is the door to the desert. So I created the door in a style inspired by the USW's desert to keep things nice and themed, before adding the same theme to the inside of the door, as I really wanted it to feel like you're heading to another realm when you exit through these doors, since they do actually lead all the way to the biome that they're themed on. Yes, these doors literally connect these biomes with long, winding tunnels. So to continue the themed doors, I made some adjustments to the upper entrances before adding an entrance themed around the Mesa's wolf tribe, and of course the final entrance was themed around the jungle, leading straight into the ancient jungle city. To tie things in nicely with the cave, I created a curved wall design before spending a long time decorating the back walls and floors in a typical dwarven style, as well as adding some soulfire lighting to tie in with the 1.19 theme, as these are going to be a key part of 1.19's ancient cities. With the main shell of the entrance and market area almost complete, I connect it up to what will later be the main forge area with a dwarven bridge, before making the final tweaks to the front wall. I think you guys will be excited for what I have planned for these archway designs later on. Finally, I made some final tweaks to the finer details of the walls and floor designs, before getting started with the market, starting off with some wool that I use for planning. I plotted out a marketplace, building a range of different market stalls using warped materials to tie in with the colour scheme. I then replaced some of the warped blocks with the new sculk sensors, which of course we're going to need for our deep dark cave. They also serve an important purpose to our dwarves, which we'll find out about later on. Now this entrance and trading area is the perfect place to gather supplies for a long adventure into the caves. Once you see the scale of what's coming, you'll definitely want to be geared up. Before we revisit our forge area and with our entrance complete, it's time to head over to begin the city, which will line the walls of the cave. I connected the city's foundations to the main forge area, before adding the main staircases to connect the different levels to one another. Since this city was going to connect and interact with the main forge area, I decided to get it all plotted out with wool in advance, so I knew exactly what space I was working with and how everything was going to link together, because I really wanted to make sure that the system made logical sense. I then continued my wall plan across the foundations of our city, incorporating plans for the factions' banners and relics, as well as plotting out paths for the water channels throughout the city. And to kick things off, I began with the bottom level of the city. In our dwarves culture, they actually didn't have a typical class system. Instead, the younger dwarves inhabited the lower city, working hard and providing for their people, working their way up the tiers with age, until eventually making it to the elders' dwellings, studying the ancient dwarven texts. Also, you may have gathered that this is the Amethyst faction from the current rooftop designs. However, this didn't quite feel right, so I switched to our warped skulk rooftops to match the market and the 1.19 theme of this build. We'll still be including different details to set apart the two factions, which you'll see shortly. Now to tackle the middle layer of our deep dark city, I added some slightly larger buildings, since the dwarves gain more luxury as they work their way up the city. I also switched the main building materials as well, and I think it's really starting to look like a deep dark city now. And to make way for the top tier of the city, I made some final tweaks to the arching roof supports, ready for our final additions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these dwarves have their very own library of ancient texts, which sits at the very top of their city. Generations of elders have studied these texts, even discovering ways to protect their city from the miners from the surface. The dwarves couldn't live with such a threat after their historical conflicts with the surface dwellers. Despite the serious reading that goes on in this library, it looks like a pretty cozy place to get lost in a good book. And of course, I had to add the elders' dwellings at the end of the top tier, taking inspiration from that classic Erebor style of building from The Hobbit. To finish up the city, I built the water channels we plotted out earlier with wool, and then mirrored the city to the other side, joining them to the entrance and trading area with more bridges. Now you'll remember me mentioning the two factions of dwarves, and you may have guessed that each faction inhabits one side of the city, depending on their strengths. They're very much seen as equal, but different, so their cities reflect this. Neither faction is inferior to the other. The Amethyst faction is based around innovation and creation, known for their extraordinary abilities to find valuable materials and use them to construct magnificent designs. The Copper faction is based around survival, known for their fierce fighting style and their sharp, savvy approach to surviving, affording them the greatest endurance no matter the odds. The factions each have two key relics representing their core values. The Amethyst faction has a pickaxe and a shovel, mirroring their roles in mining and creating, whilst the Copper faction has an axe and a sword, representing their survivalist abilities. And of course they keep the copper hammer of their ancestors in their banner. Whilst they've found more efficient fighting tools to use themselves, they still honour their heritage with this symbol. This deep dark dwarven city is insane, and we're not even finished up yet. And with the main city complete, it's time to finally start linking things up to the main forge. As you can see, we're adding a cave entrance at the edge of the city and finally getting started on those hanging conveyors. Now that I'm finally transforming this world, you can see that I've incorporated these pouring towers where the conveyor buckets tip the mined materials, which you can see is gold in this case, into the smelting pots. These hanging conveyors work their way around the entire network of caves in a looped system, so that the dwarves and the other interbiome miners can keep the smelters operating virtually non-stop with an endless supply of gold. And finally, we're back at the forge area, creating our main base for weapon and tool creation. Once the materials have been smelted at the founder's smelting area, the liquid is poured into buckets and transported across the water to this forge. The pouring towers then transfer the liquid into these new vats, which keep the liquid heated with fires, kept roaring by the bellows that you can see next to them. The liquids can then be poured into molds and forged into weapons on the forging tables, where the dwarves beaver away to create the most powerful tools and weapons of the USW. This is possibly one of my favourite parts of the build so far. I had to tackle things in a bit of a strange order to plot everything out properly, but it was definitely all worth it to see the forge up and running, linking so seamlessly with the rest of the elements in the cave. And of course, the dwarves need a place for fishing and transporting supplies, so I added in some docks at the bottom of the two sides of the city and dot around some boats carrying some materials. Since Amethyst Geodes are a 1.18 addition to the game, and one of our factions is named after it, I had to add in my own Amethyst Geodes at the back of the cave, as well as a bunch of cave entrances and platforms to start our cave network. The caves wind through this back wall, creating an intricate mine network full of epic loot and materials, including copper of course, since we can't leave out the copper faction either. Honestly, these caves took forever to map out, but they're going to be great fun to explore. Especially once we've added in the minecart system. And if you've been keeping up with the mini-movie series on the StephBlox channel, you guys will recognise this emerald cave from the desert chapter, where many friendships are born and even a plot to overthrow the pharaoh was hatched. And of course, I haven't forgotten about the warden. In fact, the dwarves had many a battle with the wardens of the Deep Dark when searching for a home safe beneath the surface. When they settled here and expanded this cave, they used sculpt materials on their rooftops to alert them of trespassers entering their city. These materials were stolen from the wardens, who had become the dwarves' greatest enemy, eventually striking an attack on the city. The Copper faction defended the city from harm, and the dwarves were victorious, locking the wardens away in these dungeons across the city. The wardens now act as guards to the dwarves' most valuable treasure collections. We thought this would be an epic way to incorporate the wardens into this transformation, giving you guys mini bosses to tackle in your adventures, and also doubling up as a mini upgrade for Minecraft's dungeons too. Will you tackle the wardens head to head, or will you take the stealthy approach? And lastly, to finish the caves, I tweaked the vines to make sure that none were broken, and added some giant hanging lanterns based on the design I used in my Underground Kingdom build. I then tweaked the number of glowberry vines until I was happy with them, before finishing up with a crazy network of working minecarts, connecting the forge to the whole cave network and spanning across the entire back wall of the cave. So, with that, let's take a look at the Ultimate Survival World's new upgraded caves. So, to get started on this blank canvas, we're draining the water from the area and creating lots and lots of space to work with. I then began with the terraforming, using sand to create a natural looking landscape where I had cut away at the original ocean floor using World Edit. I also created a long, gradual slope to the ocean floor, leading away from the USW and towards the natural oceans, since this transformation is situated in that horseshoe-shaped bay of the island. And with the main base shape laid down, I converted the sand back to stone and began working on some super exaggerated, fantasy-style arches to line this enormous area we're working with, and later frame our ocean monument really nicely with a coral reef. I of course had to add some caves and overhangs for exploration too, making the base landscape as dynamic a canvas as possible for placing plenty of decorations and secrets later. And to finish up the base landscape, I added some more gnarly rocks varying in shape and size to act as the main foundations for our coral later on, trying my best to create as many interesting areas as possible before painting the entire environment with a natural gradient, leaving the sand in place where it would naturally fall. Anyway, to fill our empty canvas with some vibrant colours, it's time for the coral. Now, I already made some large coral from my Underwater Kingdom project that I was really happy with, so I decided to use some of it for this project too. But to make sure that this massive reef had plenty of variation, I also built some new coral types. That way we can place a wide range of sizes, colours and shapes around the huge landscape. In a similar way, I also nabbed some of the shells from my Underwater Kingdom project, making some tweaks to the colours so that they were a little more natural and also adding some new shell variants as well. Steph and I then took on the challenge of placing all of these shells around the vast landscape, some hidden in caves, others sitting in the sand on the ocean floor. You can already see that this place is packed with some super dynamic terrain and tucked away areas to explore. And of course, plenty of nooks and crannies where I can hide secrets for you guys to discover. It's already starting to look like it's teeming with life and we're just getting started. Speaking of liveliness, as promised, we're incorporating a giant glow squid based on the tentacles I built from the enormous kraken I created in my Underwater Kingdom project. I know you guys must be wondering how the hell a giant glow squid fits into all of this. And I'm not surprised. Without spoiling too much of the story, the glow squid was sent by the Witch Coven of the Mushroom Swamp Island to retrieve a powerful enchanted artifact, which they'd misplaced when they first fled from the main island. This artifact is actually the key to this entire transformation, causing this insane environment to blossom and explaining why it's limited to this particular radius. The Coven sent the giant glow squid to retrieve the artifact, but it had already fallen into other hands, who weren't willing to give it up. They used the power of the artifact to defeat the witch's glow squid, binding it to the very island from which it was sent. Two of its giant tentacles remain exposed, lashing around in its attempts to escape, bringing down any unfortunate ships that sail too close to the witch's island. I wonder if the strange artifact that everyone wants to get their hands on has something to do with the ocean monument and those who built it. And what happens to the lost souls of the ship's crews? I suppose we'll just have to find out later in the video, although I reckon those shipwrecks are packed full of secrets for you to uncover yourselves. And anyway, moving on from that little tidbit of lore, let's finish up this environment and place the coral and seaweed. There's a hell of a lot of ground to cover here. As you can see, placing this coral completely transforms the entire ocean floor, creating a magical coral reef packed full of opportunities for adventure. There is literally coral spanning as far as the eye can see. The more you look, the more details you see, and the more that you want to explore this place. Honestly, this place is pretty insane. I can't believe how intricate this reef turned out and how cool the shipwreck graveyard looks. As you can imagine, we've hidden ridiculous amounts to find in this crazy jungle of coral. There's virtually an endless supply of caves, archways, shells, coral and sunken ships to lose yourself in. And it's going to be a real challenge. So definitely get your night vision and water breathing potions at the ready. Now initially, I wasn't sure exactly what to start with for this build, but I quickly realised that that God of the Sea statue head entrance we planned would really help me work out the scale this thing needed to be. So, taking inspiration from Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, I moulded this Poseidon-esque head from Prismarine, with its mouth open, ready to swallow up those of you who'll be crazy enough to venture into this monument. But why does the entrance depict the God of the Seas? Well, that all ties into that powerful artifact that I mentioned earlier, lost by the fleeing witches many centuries ago. The mysterious artifact, which was an enchanted heart of the sea, was accidentally dropped into the ocean, swept out with the tide, forming a powerful conduit in the USW seas. For years, the conduit sat alone on the ocean floor, absorbing the ocean's power and gradually growing in size, transforming the surrounding landscape until eventually it was discovered by adventurers from a distant land. They were pirates, travelling to the USW in search for the lost treasure of the evil pharaoh. But they ventured too close to the witch's mushroom swamp island and were struck by a devastating spell. Their ship washed up on the shores of the desert without its crew, with the first clue to the treasure hunt left inside. The crew were seemingly lost to the treacherous waters until they discovered the heart of the sea. To their surprise, once they neared its glowing light, they could somehow breathe underwater and gained other powers too. It had saved them from a grisly fate and actually gave rise to a new race of people thanks to the powers of the heart of the sea. And so they believed that the god of the seas had plucked the heart from one of the witch's pockets, placing it on the ocean floor in its rightful place. The Mer people worshipped the god of the seas as their saviour, and of course included a depiction of him in their monument. Anyway, while explaining some of that crazy backstory, we now have a blocked out monument structure heavily based on the original vanilla version. A grand God of the Seas statue head entrance, and some small trident bearing guards that I've put to the side for now. We'll come back to those right at the end of the monument's exterior transformation. With the main structure laid out, it's time for the fun part. Lots and lots of detail. Even though the vanilla ocean monument is a bit of a strange looking structure, it's actually arguably one of the most detailed structures in the game, so I had to do it justice. Starting with the bottom layer, I designed the main supporting pillars and added some intricate archways, incorporating plenty of sea lanterns to keep these details nice and visible later on. I then moved on to the next layer, detailing the smaller pillars and adding a wavy design under the slopes of the roof. This part is actually called the pediment in classical architecture. And before we move on to the next layer, I decided to tweak our God of the Sea's head to match the materials more coherently with the rest of the monument and add sea lanterns into his eyes to make them pop. Next up, mimicking the other small pillar designs, I started detailing the next layer, and you can see things are really starting to take shape nicely now. Continuing with these ornate details, I created a design to line the bottom walls. Even though they're pretty hidden for the most part, I wanted to pay attention to every detail here and make this as immersive as possible for you guys. And so, to finish up the detailing of the main structure, I got to work on the top level, also adding a small platform at the back where something special will sit later on. At the top of the monument, I added a staircase to the top platform, which I think fits really nicely with the roof. I then finished up the front pediment with one last pattern, before moving on to tackle the top platform, which actually plays host to that fabled artifact I mentioned earlier, the enchanted heart of the sea. After serving as salvation for the lost souls of the stranded pirate crews, the heart was positioned in pride of place on top of the monument, allowing its powers to reach far across the ocean, transforming the surroundings and its inhabitants into something magical. As well as the heart of the sea being key to the pirates' survival and the emergence of the Mer people, there were 6 large shells scattered near one another, which the stranded pirates used for shelter before they were able to build their own infrastructure. They later became known as the 6 shells of the sea. Without their protection, the ocean may have never have seen the emergence of an entire new race of people. And so, once they were strong enough, the founding crews of the Mer people led the inhabitants of the ocean and instructed that a monument was to be built and house the heart of the sea to protect them and what was left of their treasures from harm, with the 6 shells of the sea placed atop the roofs for the founding crews to reside in. With the 6 shells now all cozy in their new homes, it was time to make the final adjustments to the exterior of this monument, creating a more natural sandbank towards the entrance of the monument, and finally returning to those statues that we set aside earlier. Now, as you can see, I originally built these statues with legs, but that doesn't entirely fit with the story. Over centuries, the first lost pirates were joined by many more lost souls, cursed by the witches or caught out by the tentacles of the giant glow squid. The community quickly advanced, with rapid evolution occurring thanks to the magical heart conduit. The Mer people became their own race, their bodies completely adapting to their environment, which explains this Mer guard that I've just whipped up to guard the main entrance. However, in recognition of their earlier, pre-evolution advancements, they also built these seahorse guards. They were the original military force of the Mer people. It was essentially their underwater cavalry. They protected the people from harm's way for centuries before their rapid evolution equipped them more appropriately to protect themselves. And so, they also sit in front of the monument, their reputation as fierce warriors providing a warning to attackers and treasure hunters. It looks like the exterior of our monument is complete, and it's really looking like an epic centerpiece. The resemblance to the vanilla monument is pretty uncanny as well. Maybe I didn't get too carried away this time. The main entrance was designed to lure in enemies and thieves, where they would enter a maze of corridors followed by a labyrinth of rooms, eventually losing themselves in the complexity of the structure or stumbling across one of the guardians of the ocean. So I plotted out a grid on each floor, making lots of edits to complicate things. And you've also got to remember that inside an ocean monument, the exits and entrances to each room can come from any angle. So this is going to be pretty confusing to explore on this scale. I wanted to keep things relatively simple and authentic to the vanilla structure, but added plenty of details to the corridors and rooms, with the entrances and exits varying every time, and of course scattering in some of those special room types as well. So keep your eyes peeled for loot and sponge. To be honest, working out where all the special rooms are might just about be the only way to work your way around this crazy maze. That, and a whole lot of potions and doors. Depends on your playstyle, I guess. And on this floor, we're adding the guardian chambers in the wings, those parts of the monument that jut out at the front. I thought it'd be cool to incorporate a few elements into this guardian chamber, so I added in some large central pillars, as well as a couple of treasure chamber elements. Since the mer people captured the guardians to protect their treasure, it seemed fitting to add some treasure in this room. And if you manage to outsmart these guardians, then you'll be rewarded with some loot. And to finish things up, I planned out the fourth and final floor before adding in all of the walls and secret rooms and moving on to the Grand Elder Guardian Chamber, which I just had to turn into the ultimate underwater boss battle room. I added in some giant pillars, a large floor pattern and a platform, with of course a little stash of loot to reward you if you made it this far. Props to you if you managed to get through all of this in survival. I'm super happy with how this interior turned out, and I can't wait to play it with Steph. Even though I built it, there's no way I'll remember how to get through all of these floors, and that's without even dealing with the Guardians. So to kick things off, I started building in stone, creating a variety of modular archways and buildings that I could paste around easily and add more damage to once in place. This way, I would be able to slot in the ruins into the existing environment pretty easily. I created a sand variant of the same modular buildings and structures before finding a nice spot to place things down. These stone and sand settlements actually emerged as the Mer People societies blossomed, building their own villages and establishing their own beliefs and ways of life. Eventually, they fell into conflict, destroying each other's settlements and leaving behind only the founding crews. Poisoned by the conflict, having taken sides and lost all faith in the heart of the sea, something extraordinary happened to the remaining Mer People. The heart's enchantments appeared to turn on the Mer People, seemingly weary of all the conflict. It cursed the remaining Mer People to an empty, barren life. They became known as the Drowned, lost souls aimlessly wandering the waters for eternity, attacking any who crossed their path. The monument and the heart remain dormant, although it's said that a glimmer of power remains and that the Guardians still inhabit the monument, protecting the treasures hidden deep within the maze. These ruins were highly requested by you guys, and I think they're one of the coolest spots to explore in this entire ocean. So, which side are you on, stone or sand? And so, with these mysterious ruins placed and the transformation largely complete, it was time to add the final pieces of seaweed throughout the environment, fill the entire area with water again, and create some magma bubble columns to add that final challenge when it comes to exploring this vast ocean's landscape. And our ocean transformation is finally complete, so let's take a proper look at everything that we just created. The Taiga biome is one of the most popular biomes in the game, and it features everyone's favourite block type, spruce wood. We're going to combine aspects from the Taiga and Mega Taiga biome to create the most immersive and atmospheric forest possible. To get started with this massive transformation, I obviously had to do some terraforming to make a really epic backdrop for this Viking-inspired biome. Luckily, when I created this map with World Painter, I was able to lay the foundations of a mountainscape, but there was definitely some tweaking required to get things prepared for this village, especially to fit in with everything that we'd planned. And so, the best place for this village seemed to be on the biome border, just on the edge of the Taiga and snowy mountains. Vikings actually skied for fun, and they even had a god associated with snow and skiing, so we thought it'd be fitting to give our own clan easy access to the slopes. With the main terraforming complete, it was time to add some rivers and lakes to break things up a bit and make the landscape a little more interesting. So I added some rivers between the mountain peaks and some lakes around the main valley of the biome. Next up, I created a bunch of assets to add to our environment. I built lots of conifer tree variants, as varying the structure, height, and materials of the trees really helps to make the environment look more realistic and dynamic. I also built a wide range of boulder variants to scatter around, along with a few fallen trees, which should help to make this world super immersive and fun to explore. And finally, I whipped up some smaller shrubs to dot around, which were the final addition to my little environment asset palette. And so, I placed the various Taiga assets throughout the biome, and I'm not gonna lie guys, this part is always very tedious, but the results are definitely worth it. I try to add the assets in little clusters, since this is a pretty common sight in the real world, and honestly, it just reminds me of a Bob Ross painting. As you can see, this place is looking picturesque already. Plus, I may or may not have hidden a little cabin for Bob Ross somewhere in the biome. And that's our blank canvas primed and ready for our largest village yet. Let's get planning. Just like I always do, I planned out the village with wool to make sure that the layout worked nicely. As you can see, there is a lot going into this village and a lot of thought went into it. One of the trickiest parts of these kind of projects is working out exactly where you want things to be. So making a plan like this is a real lifesaver. Plus, it's super satisfying to watch afterwards. So with the plan complete, I set out our vanilla houses ready for their upgrades and then got to work on 8 different house designs. And these are literally just the smaller buildings. I really wanted to make sure that this village had lots of variation. Sometimes it makes sense to paste in a similar variety of buildings to create a more uniform looking village, but it really depends on the type of community that you're thinking up. This village plays host to a lively bunch known as the Fafnir clan. If you're into mythology, you may recognise our inspiration for the name. In Norse mythology, Fafnir is a dwarf who turned on his family in pursuit of treasures, turning into a ferocious dragon to guard his riches. Similarly, the Fafnir clan are actually a villager-pillager hybrid turned on a subrace of their own people, the dwarves. That's right, the USW's dwarves who now live underground in their deep dark city were previously a part of the Fafnir clan. But in contrast to the Norse myth of Fafnir, it was the humans of the clan who got greedy and turned on their dwarven counterparts. Anyhow, now that I've given you guys the first of many snippets of lore, you can see that I've settled on a building style that sort of combines fantasy, medieval and Viking elements. I had a blast adding all of the little details, like the dragon heads in the peaks of the curved rooftops and the decorative banners lining the walls. It was a really fun challenge creating these houses on a smaller scale, although I'd love to do some more large-scale fantasy medieval builds in the future. And with all of these houses built, it's time to place them in. I love all of the little details in these buildings. They make a great start to the village and it's already coming to life. Next, I tackled the place of worship for this biome, which was inspired by a Nordic stave church. Now, as you guys know, we've tried really hard to include lots of different cultures and places of worship throughout the series. If you haven't seen your favourite yet, then we'll try to cover it in our next Ultimate Survival World. Anyway, you might be wondering why we took inspiration from the stave church. Well, as you can see, it's an extremely interesting building to look at. Plus, it ties into these Nordic roots that we've been so inspired by. In fact, we've created a sort of hybrid religion for this biome, which also draws on elements of Old Norse paganism, as well as Viking culture. One of the things Steph and I enjoy most about this project is appreciating different cultures and beliefs while creating something fictional. We learn so much in the process, and this building was really fun to create, particularly on a diagonal axis. With that iconic tiered exterior complete, I got to work on the inside decorating the interior with some simple seating, lighting and pulpit to wrap things up before setting the building in place at the back of the village. As you can see, it's a real statement piece. Next to our place of worship, I quickly whipped up a graveyard on the other side of the river. This was another choice inspired by Norse mythology, as the river, known as Ugjul, is said to separate the living from the dead. Moving on to something a little bit more cheery, I made a start to the Grand Feasting Hall, where the Fafnir clan would gather for banquets and answer to their leader and mightiest shield maiden, Queen Lagertha. She's also inspired by a Viking legend, which tells tales of her as both warrior and ruler of what we know now as Norway. And so, with the exterior complete, I hopped inside to create an epic banquet hall, and of course a throne for Queen Lagertha, adding lots of decorations to liven things up. I set the feasting hall in place and made some alterations to the surrounding area, adding some staircases and bridges to connect up pathways and make things accessible. As you can see, the Fafnir clan enjoy many a feast in their Grand Feasting Hall. Wait, hang on a second. Is that Thor pleading with Queen Lagertha? I think he must have stepped into the wrong filming set today. Next up, it's the fisherman's house. And as you can see, I decided to make the most of these buildings on a diagonal. I clearly love to torture myself with extra work. Anyway, obviously our clan lives in a pretty harsh environment, so they can't easily grow crops. Instead, they keep a lot of livestock and do lots of fishing, keeping their equipment and supplies in this building, where they also prepare the fish for the local market. And that's our next profession building complete. I'm loving the mini Viking rowboats. If only vanilla Minecraft boats looked more like this. So we're now moving on to the weaponsmith, which actually became a bit of a mixture of professions. What can I say? This particular villager has many talents. Some of the Minecraft professions really fit nicely with one another. So I decided to make this building a sort of weaponsmith toolsmith hybrid. I also included a banner design out front to sort of look like two swords. They kinda look like scissors actually, but maybe this villager is also the local hairdresser. Who knows? And with our multi-talented villager's house complete, I pasted it down. This place looks pretty cool actually. I might just have to pay this villager a visit when I'm next in need of a haircut. Another profession combo I thought suited each other nicely was the leatherworker and armourer. As I mentioned before, the clan keeps lots of livestock and they've got to wrap up to keep warm in the harsh winters. So they take their leather and wool to the villager who lives here. And so I finished up the leatherworker and armourer building by incorporating a cloth canopy, as I wanted to somehow indicate that this villager essentially makes the whole clan's clothes. And with our second combo profession building done, I placed it down and created a little market square containing lots of stalls and a tiny axe-wielding Viking statue in the middle of the fountain. Next up, it's time for the longhouse. Taking further inspiration from the Vikings, I decided to build a longhouse instead of a farm, since the Vikings often keep their animals inside with them, rather than having a designated barn building. So I created this hull shape, where the Fafnir clan can snuggle up to their animal buddies during the cold nights. So I finished up the longhouse and set it down before making a start on the village's sacred worship sites, the giant rune stones. Inspired by the practices of Norse paganism, Steph and I thought that it'd be a really cool addition to have a few rune sites around the village etched with various Viking runes, symbolising aspects of life that the Fafnir clan deemed most important. We included runes for protection, joy and luck, and I'll give you guys the challenge for translating the rest for yourselves. You may also have spotted the symbol of Gungnir, the spear of Odin, another Norse mythology reference, and a nod to the dwarves of the USW, who forged the Fafnir clan's most powerful weapons. Obviously our clan needs a little more protection than just their runestones, so I had to create some watchtowers which will later be connected by a large wall surrounding the entire village. And you may remember me mentioning that the clan trained dragons to fight alongside them, and they weren't the only race in the north with backup. Without spoiling too much of the next chapter, let's just say the Fafnir clan was forced to weaponize its border with ballistas to defend against threats of the giant winged variety. The War of the Dragons was a bloodbath, and that may just explain the giant dragon skull left behind in the Savanna. Anyway, I moved on to decorations, creating a berry bush patch, a pumpkin wagon, a small cart, a bench, and some fire braziers to light everything up. I then redesigned Minecraft's village bell as a giant war horn, ready to warn the villagers of danger approaching over the mountain. And of course the horn is functional, so you can annoy the poor Fafnir villagers to your heart's content. And so, to finalise the main village, Steph and I placed hundreds of decorations throughout the area, pasting in trees and rocks, setting up the market square with shops, placing the pumpkin wagons, custom berry bushes, barrel piles, and more. Meanwhile, I finished up the exterior wall, adding in the watchtowers and connecting things up with a walkway for the patrolling guards. And finally, I added some more runes to the 4 banners on the watchtowers, which I'll leave for you guys to translate and let me know if you've worked out their meaning in the comments. Then I added in the front gate, which just about wraps up the main village of our Fafnir clan. Now, since the Fafnir clan's factions are separated by a mountain range, I thought what better way to send a signal than a network of fire braziers in a similar fashion to the warning beacons of Gondor from Lord of the Rings. And so, with our beacons built, I positioned them throughout the mountainscape, connected with a rocky pathway, winding between the mountains and towards the coastal outpost. If you guys have been subscribed to the channel for a while, you may remember my PewDiePie world transformation. Well, I nabbed the longboat design I created for that, making some updates including a symbol on the sail inspired by the Vegvisir, an Icelandic stave said to guide travellers through rough weather. With lots left to do, Steph and I got to work on the coastal outpost, where the Fafnir clan start all of their pillaging excursions. I placed in the fisherman's house design from the main village and set up a small dock, added some stilted houses to the mountains and made some pathways to connect everything. I then added some platforms, built some piers and added some houses near the coastline. Meanwhile, Steph added some trees and decorations around until we eventually turned to the pillager outpost itself. Now, you may remember me transforming the pillager tower earlier in this series and using the same structure for each outpost, making alterations based on the biome's theme. So I took one of the pillager towers and we made some tweaks, setting it up as a sort of lighthouse for the port. And that just about completes the Fafnir clan's coastal outpost, and I think Queen Lagertha approves. With our coastal outpost complete, it's time to make our way through the mountain range to get started on that dragon arena. I made a large round platform in the valley and etched in the symbol of Gungnir, which you may also remember from earlier. It is said to be associated with power, protection and authority, which is the perfect trio for our dragon arena. Steph then took some of the dragon remains from the Bone Tribe and positioned them into the ring, since this is the biome where those dragons actually resided. Meanwhile, I whipped up a basic grandstand in the rock, added a watchtower from the main village, and built some platforms, which the clan's trainers would use during dragon training exercises. I added some finishing touches, including of course some battle damage, while Steph built the dragon's nesting cave at the edge of the arena. And to finish off, I created a pathway into the mountains and added a giant chain left broken alongside the dragon's remains. Clearly, the last dragons had a bit of a rough time. And that just about finishes off this little fighting arena. I can only imagine all the training exercises and epic battles that took place here before the dragons were wiped out. Now that the Taiga transformation is all wrapped up, let's take a look at everything that we've built in this crazy transformation. To revamp the environment, I painted our World Painter mountainscape and turned it all to stone so that I could have a clean slate to work with. I then had lots of fun with the GoBrush plugin to tweak and exaggerate our mountain peaks. You might also spot me setting the foundations for some of the builds we'll be working on later in the video. Next, I finished up the shaping with a little smoothing. This biome is honestly gigantic, and with all these large edits, it took days just to get this few seconds worth of footage you're watching right now. It was then time for the fun part, laying down the new snow all the way from the Taiga border to the dark forest border. Some of you guys have asked how survival friendly these mountains will be. Well, thanks to this smooth snow, the mountains are actually pretty easy to traverse, so no need to worry about your hand cramping up from constantly hitting the spacebar. After laying the snow, I fixed up all the biome borders. Obviously this isn't meant to be totally seamless because that's not how I've designed the map, but I made sure the transition isn't too jarring either. And to finish up our new mountains, I painted the rock beneath to add a bit of a gradient and make things feel even more realistic. I went for this 5-block gradient which goes from cobblestone to grey concrete, and I think it adds so much dimension to the mountain peaks. Honestly guys, I'm so happy with how these mountains turned out. I think they look much better than the old mountains I made in World Painter back when I first made the island, and they're far more suited for survival adventures. I love the results so much that I even revisited the mountains from the Woodland Mansion from earlier in the project and gave them a revamp. I'll admit I kind of rushed them before and definitely saw room for improvement. So this is how they look now. Turning back to the snowy mountains, I tidied up the coastline, adding some glaciers and drifting snow to cleanly transition into the oceans biome surrounding the island. And moving on to a very special area of this map, known as Mammoth's Pass, I wanted to add something a little different to just trees and boulders to decorate this biome. So, as an extra little biome transformation, I decided to take Vanilla Minecraft's Icy Spikes biome and create my own version through this epic valley. As well as the spikes, I also added several custom ice lakes through the mountains. So be sure to pack your skates when you head to this biome, and make sure you're on the lookout for hidden achievements. And to wrap up our work on the environment, I spent a long time making some final tweaks to our main building areas. This includes adding further ice lakes, rivers and waterfalls to bring our giant mountainscape to life and ultimately make the builds feel as immersive as possible when you guys go exploring. Our good friend Godair even helped us add insane details to the environment features. Every single waterfall in the map has its own sound effects and particle effects, so coming across these in survival is super atmospheric. As always, there's hours upon hours of behind the scenes tidying up to do. Tons of unseen work goes into making sure that the biomes blend nicely, and taking the time to fix up and decorate less obvious areas that would probably be ignored in a creative build, but might mess with your experience and immersion when playing in survival. And finally, the environment is done. You can really see just how much space we have to work with now. So let's get building some structures. Now it's time to head over to Mammoth's Pass and start transforming our village. As you can see, I've got our vanilla snowy mountain village here, and I'm laying it out in a line so I can tackle each building and decoration individually to create a pretty true to vanilla upgrade for this village. A lot of the later building is going to be more expansive, and I wanted to strike the balance between accurate and epic for this final overworld biome, so we've got the best of both. As the centerpiece of the village, I built a large, cozy log cabin for our villagers to gather in. I really wanted to make use of Minecraft's snow for this design to create an interesting, sloping rooftop. I then finished up with a basic banner pattern, the emblem of the Igulu clan, who live in this village, along with the fabled protector of the USW. Anyway, for the next cabin, I again tried to recreate the shape of the vanilla house, which you can briefly spot behind. I really love this style, and the snowy rooftops make it all feel so cozy. I then got to work on revamping Minecraft's igloos, taking some inspiration from traditional Inuit housing, which includes both igloos and houses made from whalebone and animal hide. I even included some additional features for each house. This one has a rack for hanging hide. There is a really limited supply of wood in our snowy mountains, so I wanted to create a nice variety of alternate housing for our Igulu clan villagers. For this igloo, I incorporated some wood and tusk supports, added another hide rack, and even included a little dog sled. Since this is a fantasy village, I thought it'd be interesting to incorporate a chimney into an igloo design. After all, this villager won't want their furnace smoking up the place. For this igloo, I also included a drying rack for fish. It seems that this villager is the local chef. To wrap up the igloo designs, I built a couple that were partially sunken into the ground. And sticking with the theme, I kept the interiors relatively basic, elevating the sleeping areas since warmer air rises, and if you're going to live in a house made of snow, you'll need that extra warmth at night. Anyway, I then moved on to create a bone and hide tent. Now I'm not sure if this is one made with whale bones or mammoth tusks, so what do you reckon? Speaking of mammoth tusks, my next task was to create those giant mammoth remains I mentioned earlier. This valley is known as Mammoth's Pass after all. The funny thing about creating this skeleton was that a mammoth skull actually looks really strange. Obviously a mammoth or elephant trunk isn't part of the skeleton, so instead you're left with a huge opening at the front of the skull. With that little quirk in mind, I did the best that I could to imitate the skeletal anatomy on a pretty small scale, and I think it turned out awesome. It could even be a cool foundation for your own snowy mountain survival base. Wrapping up the igloo village, I created some watchtowers to guard the entrance, some campfires to keep our villagers nice and cozy, and some dog sleds for their fishing and hunting excursions. Steph and I then started to place everything, starting with the watchtowers, a spiky front fence, and mammoth remains. We then dotted the buildings around, with our largest campfire sat in the centre. In the real world, storytelling is a big part of Inuit culture, so as a fun little reference to that, the USW's Igulu clan also has its own myths and legends, which are told around the communal fire. One of its most famous legends is the tale of the Yeti, which is said to inhabit the mountains, gobbling up explorers and residing in a large cave. But the monster has never been found. I wonder if you'll be able to find his icy cavern and steal his dinner. Anyhow, monsters and legends aside, heading back to our igloo village, we carefully placed the remaining houses and decorations to finish up, and also added a second lore-related area hidden in the mountains. This magical ice forge was the birthplace of the island's most powerful weapon, the Sword of Akna. Disguising the weapon as a basic iron sword, the clan's enchantress Akna forged the most powerful sword in the land, entrusting it to her son, who would become the protector of the USW. Many a tale has been told about the protector and his adventures across the vast biomes of the island, and you may remember that his sword lies in the dark forest, encased in stone, awaiting a worthy adventurer to take up his mantle. And I hope you guys are up for the challenge. And without delving too deeply into the lore, that about wraps up our epic Mammoth's Pass Valley and the Igulu clan's cozy village. So with that done, let's head on over to the mountain peaks. So for the island's final place of worship, we wanted to do something really special. As you guys know, we've been taking inspiration from many different religions to create fictional places of worship to transform Minecraft's vanilla church across the biomes of the island. For the snowy mountains, we had some ideas in mind about what kind of build we wanted to do, and researched different temples, monasteries, and more to select some inspiration. It was really hard to choose, and you all had so many lovely ideas, but in the end, we just had to opt for what we felt fit best with this biome. So, we drew our inspiration from a Buddhist monastery located in Bhutan, specifically Paratak Sang, also known as the Tiger's Nest. And as a nod to this inspiration, we've nicknamed our build the same. Ultimately, we just cannot include inspirations from every religion and culture in this survival map, but we'll definitely be including some more in our next one, so comment down below what you'd like to see. Anyhow, whilst I've been rambling, you can see this gigantic statue taking shape. Steph and I really wanted to combine our Buddhist inspirations with some epic fantasy elements, and I thought that it would be fun to make a statue that interacts with the world in a unique way. So we thought, why not have a huge statue carved from the mountains, cradling the only entrance to the Tiger's Nest. Involving organics in large builds like this is super fun, and even on a tough time limit, I love how this turned out with the shading and the draping cloth. And I think that it's time to connect it all up with that perilous path that I mentioned. So, the path begins at the foot of the mountain, with an arching stone bridge straddling the icy lakes below. Watch your step! I certainly wouldn't want to fall onto those giant ice spikes below. The path continues along the side of what is known as the Crying Mountain, under a huge waterfall, leading to a rickety wooden bridge, passing over another waterfall, and into the hands of our sacred bridge bearer, who grants adventurers safe passage to the Tiger's Nest, provided that they tread carefully, and they don't look down. That of course leads us to one of our biggest tasks for this biome, which, you guessed it, needs some planning with coloured wool. Steph and I spent absolutely ages plotting all of this out. We wanted it to be a really exciting place to explore, with lots of different levels and connecting bridges, rooms, and paths to get lost in. During this process, we did some research and decided on some of the purposes for each building. We plan to make monistic cell blocks, i.e. where our Minecraft monks will sleep, various temples, libraries, storage rooms, as well as a balneary for washing and a refectory for eating. Obviously, all of our work gets cut down massively for these videos, but as always, there's lots of cleaning up to do to make way for interiors and get the plan ready to transform into the final build. You guys would be amazed at all the extra time that we spend on tweaking things like this. These things are usually overlooked for creative builds, but making a fully functioning map is a lot of extra work. With the tidying done after many more hours of pain, I swapped out the colours across the build so that I could paint a nice gradient for the walls. I then painted each section with a white gradient and worked on a rooftop design, incorporating some of Minecraft's 1.19 editions, mangrove wood and mud bricks. This colour palette is super unique and different to anything else that we've done in the USW so far. So, what do you guys think? Moving on to detailing, I made some adjustments to the wall gradients and got to work on adding lots of intricate details to this build. My main inspiration, Parataxang, is packed with ornate, decorative detail, its walls lined with vibrant reds and golds, and each section looking unique to the last. So I tried my best to emulate these awesome features in my build, obviously with a more exaggerated fantasy twist, creating rickety walkways, ornate windows, mini mountainside temples, and much more to make this as fun to explore as possible. With the main detailing complete, I fixed up all of the courtyards, and decorated with wagons and some other little features, including a large hand washing basin outside the refectory. For the hidden courtyard at the back, we wanted to create a special, sacred place, similar to the monuments and mantras carved into the stone hillsides of real-world Buddhist monasteries. Keeping with our Tiger's Nest theme, I whipped up a large tiger engraving in the courtyard, said to depict a manifestation of the monks' god, which guided their founder to safety during the War of the Dragons. But of course, that's a story for the StephBlox channel. Anyway, it's common for Buddhist monasteries to house many depictions of the Buddha, and in our fantasy religion, we thought that it'd be nice to do something similar. So I adapted our elemental totem statue from the ancient jungle city into something a little more fitting and added some of them around the hidden tiger engraving. As a further reference to our inspirations, I hung some prayer flags near the courtyard. Prayer flag colours typically represent different elements. Perhaps you guys could come up with 3 key elements of the Ultimate Survival World project for these colours to represent. We'll try to include the best ideas in the official backstory. And without giving too much away, Steph and I have included some really cool interiors for you guys to explore, just as we planned earlier in the video. There's a huge, grand temple in the middle of the complex with hanging drapes and vast ceilings, along with connecting libraries of sacred texts spanning across multiple floors. You can even explore the monks' maze of bedrooms, and much, much more. I say it every time, but this place is going to be insanely fun to explore. It's genuinely been a pleasure to draw inspiration from different cultures for places of worship throughout this project, and I can only hope that I've done them at least some justice, even with my fantasy creations. So here's to more of this in future projects. Last but not least, we're heading just over the mountain to a magical lush valley. Like always, I started with some planning using coloured wool to get a feel for the general layout of this epic mountain village. I then whipped up a variety of giant bonsai trees, which may just be my favourite trees that we've created in the USW. We wanted this area to be really unique and special, since it's our last build on the island, and these trees are definitely different to anything else that we've done in the other biomes. After creating a range of shapes and sizes, I shaded the trees with different wood variants, including birch and mangrove, ready to be placed around at the end. With our trees set aside for later, I began designing a fantasy temple known in USW lore as the Dragon Samurai Temple. The villagers who live at Bonsai Falls are known for their relationship with dragons, much like the Fafnir clan from the Taiga. But their approach to dragon training was far more peaceful, and this disparity led to the biggest conflict in the USW, the War of the Dragons. This temple was the birthplace of the Dragon Samurai, a group of fierce fighters and dragon trainers, the only to understand the importance of balance and honour in all things. This lore is obviously inspired by the Japanese samurai of our history, who may not have tamed dragons, but definitely influenced some of the characteristics of our fantasy race. Anyhow, I thought it would be awesome to involve a dragon head into the design of this building, plus it ties in with the lore really well. I used a dragon head that I'd built for an old Game of Thrones build, adding some flowing tendrils, and switching things to a more suitable colour palette. And I cannot wait for you to see this guy added to the temple. I set aside our dragon head and continued with the building. You can clearly see East Asian influences in each section of this building, and this is easily one of my favourite styles to build in. This style is so distinct, and one of my favourite elements is definitely the forms of lighting it incorporates. In both China and Japan, for example, lanterns are an iconic part of various traditions. From Japan's beautiful Toronagashi festival to commemorate the dead, to the Yuan Shao festival marking the end of the Chinese New Year. So for this build, I really wanted to incorporate some large lanterns into the structure itself, which also contained small memorial shrines as a nod to the traditions of the Toronagashi. These lanterns were inspired by some artwork from Jason Zhu. To finalise our Dragon Samurai Temple, I built a grand pillared entrance with a long stone staircase. I'm kind of envisioning Po from Kung Fu Panda clambering up all of those stairs to the Jade Palace, but I didn't quite go that crazy. With the grand entrance ready, I finally found the perfect place to set down the dragon head that I made earlier and wrap things up with some finishing touches. With the Dragon Samurai Temple complete, I placed it down before moving on to the interior. In our last biome, we did something a little different for our Minecraft village bell upgrade, making a giant war horn for our Viking-inspired village. This time, I'm creating a large gong inside this temple, a means through which the Dragon Samurai are summoned. And, you guessed it, you'll be able to interact with this in the map, but I'll leave that for you to play around with yourselves. For the rest of the interior, I kept the ceilings high and added rafters, as well as some secrets. So be on the lookout for hidden areas and test your ninja reflexes across the high beams. The Dragon Samurai Temple is a real spectacle, and it makes a great start to our bonsai village. Moving on to our village buildings, I kept the same colour palette and style as the temple and designed our first Talon Clan house. To add some variation, I made a stone foundation variant and a wood stilt variant, making these designs much more versatile. It can be used at ground level or elevated as a cliffside house. For the second house, I repurposed the first design and expanded upon it with a second level beneath. It was really fun to play around with elements like the hip and gable roof, which is essentially what you can see at the top of this house, and I got to experiment with mangrove wood in house designs for the first time. Again, I built a stilt version of the same design, and I love how dynamic these look. They're going to be great for exploring, and they of course all have interiors as well. And of course, this wouldn't be complete without a little pagoda style house, so I quickly whipped up a small building with stacked eaves before moving on to the next house design. I gave this one a round door for some more variation, and it kind of reminds me of Pandaria from World of Warcraft. You may have also noticed I came up with a banner design for the clan, creating lanterns to decorate each house and tie everything together nicely. Now, since Bonsai Falls is full of waterfalls and rivers, it only makes sense to add some bridges, another structure that has a really distinct look across East Asia. For this bridge, I added a rooftop and went for a stacked fantasy style on either end, with lots of variation in height and shape. For the interiors of this bridge complex, it made sense to include some racks for hanging small fishing boats, as well as storage, and lots of other nooks and crannies for you to get lost in during your survival adventures. There are so many secrets hidden in these buildings and throughout the world, guys. I just can't wait for you to stumble across them for yourselves. To make sure everything is bustling and lively, I whipped up some decorations. A couple of wagons, a well, a stone lantern, and a Torii Gate inspired structure to place near our Dragon Samurai Temple to mark the sacred grounds. And now, the fun part, placing everything we created to fill this lush valley with life. Steph and I started with the large bridge, adding boats to the rivers before moving on to the main houses. We then whipped up another smaller bridge using those pagoda style buildings either side, with a classic red arching bridge sandwiched between them. We continued to scatter the buildings through the valley. It honestly took a really long time to get things right, and fixing up all of the scaffolding to make things survival friendly was pretty fiddly. But once that was all sorted, the best part by far was placing those giant bonsai trees we made earlier. These gnarly trees look so cool in this setting, and making a wide variety of shapes for these definitely makes the whole area look really natural. With everything placed, I mapped out some pathways to connect everything up and added staircases and bridges to make all the areas accessible, while Steph began to light the village up with those stone lanterns that we made. We then added the Torii Gate in front of the Dragon Samurai Temple, adding a large koi pond full of fish and a bamboo area for some very special residents. We finished the decorating with some boulders, flowers and grass covering the entire valley, before returning back to the temple to make way for our Panda Haven. We changed the biome in these areas to bamboo jungles and spawned some furry friends. I think this was Steph's favourite part of the entire project. I have to admit, these pandas are pretty cute. Also, did you guys know that they had different emotions and behaviours? And to finish up this area, we added the island's second dragon arena with an iconic yin and yang inspired symbol etched into the ground. This represents the bond the Talon clan shared with their dragons, and is a pretty stark contrast to the scenes found at the Fafnir clan's arena in the Taiga. I think you guys are going to love the lore in this area, and it may just involve the origins of Minecraft's Ender Dragon. And with that, you guys, the Snowy Mountains is complete. So, let's take a look at the biome. First and foremost, Steph and I headed to the centre of the island to revisit the ruined portal that I created all the way back at the start of this project. We restored the portal and lit it up. To be honest, it's kinda crazy to think that this is how it looked once upon a time in USW lore. We hopped through the portal to take a look at what naturally generating terrain was waiting for us on the other side. We came across some really awesome vanilla terrain and crimson forests throughout the caves, and knew that the giant custom cavern that we'd planned would fit in here perfectly. Before clearing out the cave, I converted the nether portal to a more fitting colour and added new vines, since this was the underworld version after all. I decided it made the most sense to transform the USW's nether in a specific radius around where the island's ruined nether portal leads. So I got to work on the terraforming, which involved clearing out an enormous area, and I even extended the height of the nether just for this section. The top bedrock layer looks pretty ridiculous from the outside, but luckily none of you guys will ever get to see that. Now obviously a giant cube cave wouldn't be all that immersive, so I did a bunch of terraforming to make things feel realistic, and this is already looking like something from Stranger Things. Anyway, since Minecraft's natural terrain generation in the nether can be pretty wacky, I thought it only made sense to have some fun with the terrain in my build. So with the basic cave ready to go, I whipped up some cool shapes for our floating islands, where I'd be building some epic biome transformations. I had to head outside the cave to do this with the tool that I wanted to use, before hopping back inside to place these islands around the cavern, even using some of them to make stalactites from the ceiling, which we'll decorate a little more later in the video. To break up the red, I painted the walls with a patchy gradient before scattering around a few more islands and making a giant lava lake surrounded by pieces of terrain breaking away from the edges. With our backdrop all set, I started on the first biome transformation, the Crimson Forest. I really wanted to keep things feeling authentic to vanilla for this upgrade, so I tried super hard to just build larger, more realistic versions of the vanilla crimson trees. I placed my new trees around the floating islands on one side of the cavern, adding some large boulders as well as some lava pools. And in classic Minecraft style, I of course had to have some lava falls spilling over the edges too. And for the warped forest, I pretty much just followed the same process on the other side of the cave, since the two biomes are so similar in vanilla. So moving on to the next biome, we're tackling the Soul Sand Valley. Now you may have noticed that I've nabbed the skull that I built in my desert temple transformation. That's because I wanted to repurpose it to create an epic demon skull for the Soul Sand Valley. Since this biome is the only place that you can find fossils in the Nether, and Mojang themselves claimed they came from creatures of the past, I thought it'd be awesome to expand on this lore with a build like this. Plus, it fits really nicely with the USW's own backstory on the 12 demons of the Nether. So, Steph and I reshaped the skull, added some horns and painted on a new colour palette to make the remains of a really creepy, demonic creature to place in the biome. I then switched out the normal fire in the eye sockets for soul fire, and made some little adjustments before placing the remains in the cavern, along with some giant rib cages and bones that I created earlier in the series. I also included some basalt spikes to break up the terrain a little. Plus it was a nice way to tie in the Soul Valley with the Basalt Delta biome. And it wouldn't be a true Soul Valley upgrade without scattering some soul fire throughout the biome. So moving on to the final biome, the Basalt Delta. Since this is so annoying to traverse in vanilla, and we already have plenty of crazy terrain in this cavern, I decided to keep things simple and make these areas a little more survival friendly. I built some stacked basalt rock formations, added some lava pools and scattered some blackstone variants, since in vanilla Minecraft it's more likely to generate here than in any other biome. And before we move on to our nether structures, I wanted to add some finishing touches to the cavern, firstly by adding some caves to connect to the vanilla environment, just in case you guys fancy exploring beyond this area. These caves look so cool on the walls of the cavern, and the giant stalagmites and stalactites make it a super immersive transition between exploring my cavern and the vanilla environment. And finally, to finish up the environment, I realised I hadn't actually added any glowstone, so I had a really cool idea of how I could incorporate it into the ceiling of the cavern. I tried out a bunch of different patterns until I found something that looked as though the ceiling had cracked, revealing the glowstone above. This effect looks so awesome, especially with high bloom shaders. You may also find some extra gilded blackstone sources and some ancient debris tucked up high as well. So, that completes our environment and biome transformations. There are so many different areas to explore here, and to be honest, I think this will make a great place for hide and seek with some of your friends. So next up, we're tackling the Bastion Remnant. You may have actually spotted the red floor plans earlier in this video, and if you're watching closely, you'll have seen we're making one for each side of the cavern. So, I blocked out the main structure with coloured concrete. Usually I'd use wool, but it's a bit of a fire hazard here in the Nether. And as you can see, I've based the shape on a real-life Bastion fortress structure. Because let's be honest, I don't think any of us really know exactly what this is. Anyway, with the main structure blocked out, I decided that I wanted to do something organic for the entrance. Since the Bastion is home to the piglins and piglin brutes, I thought it would make sense if one of the creatures of the past, referenced by Mojang, were a race of giant piglins, who perhaps was at war with the large demonic creatures whose remains also lie in the Soul Sand Valley. To honour their ancestors and ward off thieving adventurers, the present-day piglins incorporated these remains into their entrance in an attempt to protect their precious gold from you guys. And there are lots more challenges waiting on the inside. Next, I painted the Bastion with a gradient, adding some lava falls dripping down the walls, and built the entrance, lining it with soul fire braziers. Next, I added more fire braziers, finishing up with a giant soul fire flame roaring up top. I also switched out some of the giant piglin skull blocks, because Steph said the horns looked like a mustache and we couldn't unsee it. My guy literally looks like Mario with a nose ring. Moving on from our mustached piglin, for the interior, I divided everything up and built a long menacing corridor for the entrance, with lava falls, hanging chains and etched patterns on the floor. I wanted to make sure that this structure had some challenging obstacles like the vanilla one, with some tough areas to traverse if you want to get your hands on all of the loot. So, with the help of our dev Godder, we made some parkour courses through lava pools on each level. On each floor you'll find a different parkour course, which will get increasingly harder as you progress further up the Bastion with better loot available on each level. Eventually you'll reach the top floor, where you'll find the ultimate parkour challenge lining the wall. And if you can make it to the top, you'll find some epic loot up for grabs. So with our Bastion complete, I mirrored it over to the other side and tidied up the surrounding environment to wrap up our Bastion Remnant upgrade. Even though this is more of a simple upgrade for me, I love how this turned out, especially with the expansion of our Minecraft lore and the parkour challenges throughout the interior. So moving on to the biggest structure in the Nether, we're tackling the Nether Fortress. As usual, I set everything out with coloured blocks to plan the structure, and I actually based the main segment on the same shape as our Bastion Remnant. Obviously, vanilla Minecraft's Nether Fortress is mostly bridges and walkways, so I wanted to make sure I captured this in my transformation, planning lots of bridges to different towers, which will each contain trials and challenges of their own. I also connected the fortress up to a platform beneath the Nether portal with a bridge, which I'll later on be damaging to fit with some of our lore. I got to work with the detailing and painting, opting for this really cool gradient from black concrete powder to red nether brick. This platform area was looking a little too bland, so I decided to repurpose my Jungle King statue from the Deep Dark transformation and use him to prop up the overhanging terrain. To change things up from the bone remains scattered around the cavern, I decided to create this spooky devil-like statue, also combining it with a lava feature. What do you think his story should be? Is he a lost soul condemned to serve the Nether? Or perhaps he's related to the demons whose remains can be found in the Soul Sand Valleys? Be sure to let me know in the comments. Moving on, I continued the detailing and painting along the main bridge, which I'll be adding some damage to later on. I worked my way over to the main fortress, detailing the small bridges and towers at the front, also tackling the interiors as well, since everything needs to be survival friendly and immersive to explore. Even though I followed the same formula for building these bridges, it actually took a long time to add all of the details, especially since I'm doing all the physical building alone. Plus, I included nether wart farms, spawner rooms, and lava fall rooms, and these are just the medium-sized towers. Honestly, this place is vast and really brings some new challenges to exploring Minecraft's Nether Fortress. In the largest towers, you'll even find dungeons infested with mobs and villagers trapped in cages. If you search hard enough, you'll even find where the piglin guards chill out and take their lunch breaks when they're not keeping watch of their prisoners or scouring the Nether for gold. Anyhow, I finished off painting the external towers with that dark, creepy gradient and added some epic fire braziers to finish them off before turning to the main, central segment of the fortress. I quickly fixed up the plan and started adding crenellations to decorate the entrance. Heading inside, I plotted out a grand hallway from the entrance, lined with giant pillars and lava falls, before heading back outside to finish up the exterior, as I don't want to spoil the rest of the interior for you guys. For the front of the building, I thought it would look awesome to incorporate lava into the design, so I built a network of channels to allow the lava to cascade down the fortress, and of course added some more of those fire braziers that I designed earlier to bring the whole build to life. And to go out with a bang, I built a giant nether star to sit atop the fortress. This star is said to empower the piglins who rule over this realm, and it is believed to have dropped from a huge wither who once roamed the Nether along with the other giant creatures that are now mostly extinct. These creatures were known as the 12 demons of the Nether, with each race empowered by a different negative trait from the overworld. For instance, the Wither is known in USW lore as the Demon of Greed. So, tying in with all that epic backstory, I decided to build some giant cages to place around the cavern. These cages were used by the Piglin clan to capture the last surviving ancestors of the 12 demons of the Nether, but they broke free and escaped, now wandering the Nether and capturing the souls of Minecrafters like you guys. Their empty cages are scattered around the cavern. I wonder if you can find all 12. When the demons escaped, they also broke the bridge to the Nether Fortress in all of the commotion, so that'll be another challenge for you guys to tackle when you head to the Nether for yourselves. And that just about wraps up our spooky Nether transformation. This place is so creepy, you guys. Even though I said that this was going to be a smaller upgrade, it's ended up pretty massive. So with the Nether done, I still had tons left to build, so I headed back to the overworld and got to work on upgrading the island's hidden stronghold, which looks like a complicated old mess when extracted from the world. I laid out all of the different rooms, sorting them by type, jumping into each one to make some epic upgrades, starting with that all-important portal room. For these upgrades, I tried my best to keep things really survival friendly with some resemblance to vanilla. Next, I tackled the library, bringing these huge stacked bookshelves, study nooks, and even a second level to explore. I of course had to finish up with a candle chandelier before quickly building some upgrades for the remaining rooms, and creating a staircase and corridor to connect all the rooms up. I then plotted out our shiny new stronghold, and to be honest guys, this place is an absolute maze. It's going to be so easy to get lost in here, and there are so many rooms to explore. As you can see, it's at least double the size of the original stronghold that you can see over there in the background. Even though I built this myself, I definitely still get lost in all of these winding corridors and staircases. And coming across dungeons like these when you're lost in what feels like the medieval equivalent of the backrooms is definitely super creepy. But you'll have to find it for yourselves, as I've hidden the upgraded stronghold somewhere in the USW, so get your ender eyes ready. And after at least 6,000 hours of hard work between Steph and I, we're on our way to the final transformation. Let's head through the end portal for our final major upgrade of the USW. Starting with the main end island, I made some improvements to the terrain to make things feel more realistic, using some of the floating islands I made for the Nether earlier to help me out a bit. I then had the idea to edit the obsidian pillars to house large crystals, perhaps fallen stars or larger versions of the end crystals that usually sit on top. It was a great idea in theory, but since the Ender Dragon has a tendency to destroy everything in its path, it didn't end up working out. I didn't want you guys to have a totally wrecked battleground to fight the Ender Dragon in, so instead I opted for something more organic and made something that suited the name Obsidian Spikes a little better. I think these clusters almost look like mystical shards from outer space that have kind of dispersed on impact with the island. And it's an added bonus that the Ender Dragon can't mess these up. Since I couldn't incorporate the crystals into the pillars themselves, I thought it'd be cool to add some crystals around the island instead, to perhaps show where Minecraft's end crystals originally came from. The original island is so bare and I didn't want to deviate too much from vanilla, but I think this addition definitely spices things up a bit. And finally, I created a mystical broken bridge, sort of inspired from the Bifrost Bridge from Thor, leading into the distance. This bridge once led to a giant floating city, and it's a big clue to let you guys know where to head in order to find it once you've defeated the Ender Dragon, since the end gateways will only lead you to the distant lands. So that leads us to the biggest transformation of this dimension, the End City. Now for this city transformation, we had a ton of ideas and suggestions. Could we make it into some kind of giant tree city, since the vanilla version sort of resembles a tree? Or perhaps something more like a futuristic space station? None of these ideas really felt right to us. The end definitely feels a little futuristic, but also very mystical and strange. So we wanted to capture all of that in our most creative design yet. So after all the planning, uncertainty, and a whole lot of sketching, this is what we came up with. We ended up with a very limited timescale to actually build this in, but I think it definitely captures the different themes of the end. The central pillar acts as a hub to the city and anchors 3 large ring systems made of mystical end dust. These rings will be home to our new end buildings, creating a multi-layered city like the original. There will also be a huge Ender Dragon statue snaking around the central pillar as a tribute to the dragon for protecting the city from outsiders venturing from the overworld. With only about 4 to 5 hours of building time for the dragon, and a big challenge ahead, I got started with the Ender Dragon sculpt. Now I know it would have been much easier to take a sculpt from the internet and import it into the world, and some people think that I've actually done this when they only see a picture of my organic builds. But honestly, a lot of the time you can tell when a model has been 3D imported, and it just doesn't look right. Plus, if I'm creating something for you guys, cutting corners just wouldn't sit right with me. So I've always invested the extra time in this project to keep it authentic and do as much as possible myself. You may only see the process for a few short seconds, but it's definitely worth it. Anyhow, creating the head on a straight axis wasn't actually too tricky for me, but the real challenge came when tilting the head down and turning it on an angle. Both of these things can really mess with the shape of something you created on a straight axis, especially for things like teeth, which are hard enough to build with square blocks as it is. But I managed to clean things up nicely before placing the head and creating a snake-like body, since this would be a wingless space dragon inspired by East Asian depictions, as opposed to a winged dragon. I painted the body in the colours of the original Ender Dragon, adding spikes down its back and ridges down its belly, before adding some arms and painting them to match the body. Also making some final tweaks to the head, using crying obsidian to add a glow around the face, as if the dragon is gearing up to breathe purple flames. I also added a glow to the mouth and some smoke coming from the nostrils, and at this point I was surprised I'd managed to build all of this in time. With the dragon mostly complete, besides a few little tweaks that you may notice appearing in the next few shots, I detailed the central pillar, adding some extra ring systems at the bottom and creating a huge spiraling parkour stairway up the middle to allow access to different levels. And finally, it was time to work on the buildings themselves. Steph and I wanted to keep this true to vanilla, but also more city-like with some mystical elements. We made these mini skyscrapers with the vanilla colour palette in mind, adding some mysterious glowing symbols to each building, inspired by the hex symbols used by Scarlet Witch in Marvel. We pretty much made up these symbols randomly, so if they accidentally look like anything from real life, it's completely unintentional. We also thought it'd be cool if the buildings were mirrored either side of the ring systems, defying gravity just like the vanilla End City does. So we did this for all of the buildings, creating the interiors as we went. We also made sure to create enough variants of the designs to keep things busy and dynamic, rather than just placing the same building over and over again. We made some small tweaks to the dragon, and then it was time to place all of our wacky buildings on the ring systems. We are so proud of this piece and how quickly we managed to put it together, and it definitely has to be our most unique creation to date. It will certainly be awesome to experience in game. I can guarantee you won't have explored anything quite like this before. And with our End City complete, I moved on to the End ships, which in vanilla, they kinda look like a basic galleon with a wacky colour palette. So with that in mind, I thought it'd be really cool to modify the galleon that we used in the overworld. Perhaps some of the fleet from the overworld took a wrong turn on the seas and fell into another dimension. Whatever your predictions on the lore, we thought a subtle nod to the overworld and everything we've been creating on the island for so long now would be a nice touch to wrap up the main transformations. I modified the colour palette to match the blocks found in the end, made some design tweaks, and created some new sails that were more spacey based on some sci-fi ships I saw online. I built these ones out of stained glass, and I love the ghost-like effect. And to add that extra oomph, I thought it'd be really cool to fit a large thruster at the back to fit with the sci-fi theme, and differentiate this from the ships in the overworld. This is a space galleon now, after all. To finish off, I added ropes to connect up the sails. I used glass panes for this section, and it definitely adds to the ghosty vibes. It's looking a little like a purple flying Dutchman. So with our end ship done, I placed them around the city, and you'll also find them scattered in the distant lands. They're all pretty close to the edge, nearer to the main island and the city, and they're definitely worth finding because each ship contains special loot, including elytra. And if you find enough of these ships, you'll eventually nab yourself a full set of netherite armor. And that wraps up our final major transformations in the ultimate survival world. So let's take a look at everything that we've built in the Nether and End. Wow, you guys, with all of the biomes transformed, we've got to work on the finishing touches, which led to some of the biggest obstacles in the whole project. First and foremost, you guys really wanted me to add some extra builds to the map, so I of course went a little overboard and added hundreds of new builds to the world. You'll find wandering wagons, hidden houses, boats, sand castles, and more. And that's not to mention all the Easter eggs and references hidden in the map. Plus, there are new builds relating to the map's story, including Pueblo Ruins, where the wolf tribe of the Savanna once resided, along with the desert's entrance to the interbiome mining network. Speaking of the mining network, we also still had the massive task of digging all the tunnels and connecting everything up. And these tunnels are so long, it literally took forever. So with everything connected up, we headed to the mining network hub, aka the deep dark Dwarven City, and added some new additions. You might remember that the dwarves took over the deep dark and trapped the wardens in these dungeons. Well, the other wardens living in the depths under the island are finally fighting back, and there's a skulk outbreak in the ancient city. Many of the dwarves have fled, and the city is extremely dangerous. If you miss a step, you'll awaken the wardens. But if you make it around the city quietly, you'll be rewarded with some epic loot and discover the ancient relics of the Amethyst and Copper factions. This is just one of many custom challenges you'll face across the USW. And to add even more to discover underground, we added almost 100 custom caves under the entire island. You'll find lush and dripstone caves, as well as our most highly requested feature, custom dungeons. To get the Minecraft community involved a little more, we thought it'd be fun to get some builders to create a few interiors for the map. So, these are some of the awesome interiors the bakery builders came up with my own edits included. There are tons more unseen interiors across the map, most of which I built myself, but it was really cool to get the community involved. With all of those features added, we were far from finished. Steph went round the entire map, adding dozens of custom weapons and armor, as well as over 100 custom books, diary entries, and special lore-related features. And the best part is the giant treasure hunt taking you across the entire island with a bunch of riddles taking you on adventures in different locations until you eventually discover what remains of the evil pharaoh's lost treasure. And since some of you guys were a little worried about performance and frame rates in the world, we created a separate optimized version for the Survival Maps Patreon tier, which also comes with standard Java and Bedrock. We literally spent hours removing demanding blocks from the map whilst trying to keep all of the important aesthetics intact, which greatly improves frame rate and will be super handy to anyone who doesn't have high PC specs. And after all of that, there was still tons more to tackle. Our insanely talented dev Godair had to help us make this all functional for unmodded survival. I can't explain to you guys how long it took to implement everything correctly for a totally unmodded world. He had to make a special loot generation tool so that we could fill all of the chests and add special additions. Plus, he had to work on other functions like making sure the Ender Eyes led to our custom stronghold and much more. And that's not to mention all of the special features that he added, spending hundreds of hours knee-deep in code to make this as immersive as possible. Every single waterfall in the map has particle effects and sounds. You'll find fireflies floating around the dark forest, several special sound events in different areas, and more. The UI has had an epic revamp, and you'll even receive a special book when you join the world to guide you in setting things up for the best experience. Plus, there are 60 totally custom achievements added to the world, which is one of my favourite features. Do you reckon you'll discover all of them and become the ultimate survivalist? And of course, this wouldn't be complete without an incredible soundtrack, which our friend Jake Rivers whipped up for us. There are more than 30 special tracks that will play throughout the biomes, matching the themes of the different areas you'll discover. And that's in addition to the custom sounds that you'll hear whilst playing the game. So, after all of that, we had a very scary task of getting this all transferred to Bedrock. And honestly guys, it was a whole journey. Firstly, we realised that Bedrock randomly has different world height to Java, but only in the Nether. We tried to convert the world file and ended up with a total mess. So I had to remodel the entire Nether just for Bedrock, which took days. And if that wasn't enough, we had a contact who was due to help with the conversion for almost a year, but a week before release, we realised that nothing was ready, and we were pretty much left in the dark with a million things to do before launch. We were totally not stressed at all though. Luckily, we got Sam on board, who literally learnt how to code Bedrock within a matter of days, and got the world working for us with only a few minor differences to Java, which is just insane. And with all of our finishing touches added, after more than a year of dedication and super hard work, the ultimate survival world is complete, and you can finally play it for yourselves. Thank you all so much for the insane support. There's plenty more to come in 2023. Now let's take one final trip together through some of the highlights of the ultimate survival world.